Hi everyone, I know you are watching this content to accompany your sleep. So before we start, I want to know where you are watching from and what time you are watching. Also, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. In late December 2003, Singapore was jolted by a rare and alarming crime. The kidnapping of a 7-year-old girl from her family's residence in Yio Chu Kang. The incident not only shocked the nation, but also highlighted the vulnerabilities that even a city renowned for its safety could face. The masterminds behind this audacious act were two men, Tan Ping Kun and Chua Ser Lin. Tan, then 35 years old, was grappling with significant financial difficulties. He had accumulated substantial debts, and the pressure from creditors was mounting. In his desperation, Tan confided in his friend of 7 years, Chua, a 42-year-old cleaning company owner, who was also facing his own financial woes, owing approximately 600,000 Singapore dollars. The duo, both ensnared in financial turmoil, deliberated on various illicit means to alleviate their debts. Initially, they contemplated drug trafficking, but eventually dismissed the idea due to its inherent risks. Instead, they settled on a more sinister plan, kidnapping for ransom. Their target was the family of a managing director, who was a former business partner of Chua's childhood friend. They believed that by abducting one of the director's children, they could extort a substantial sum of money. After meticulous planning, on December 25, 2003, Christmas Day, they decided to execute their plan. The choice of date was strategic. They anticipated that the festive atmosphere would make the family less vigilant. On that day, Tan and Chua drove a car with falsified license plates to the director's residence. Observing that the gate was open and the household was engrossed in preparations for a Christmas party, Chua donned a mask and stealthily entered the premises. He swiftly abducted the 7-year-old daughter from the living room and hurried back to the car, where Tan was waiting. They sped away, but their actions did not go unnoticed. The girl's brothers and a catering assistant witnessed the abduction. The assistant's husband attempted to pursue the kidnappers, but after a tense 30-minute chase, Tan and Chua, realizing they were being followed, decided to release the girl in Tampines. Miraculously, she was unharmed and was soon reunited with her family. Undeterred by their initial failure, Tan and Chua contacted the girl's father the following day, demanding a ransom of 1 million Singapore dollars and threatening harm if their demands were not met. The father, cooperating with the police, negotiated the ransom down to 70,000 Singapore dollars. On December 27, 2003, the ransom was delivered at a predetermined location on the Pan Island Expressway. Unbeknownst to Tan and Chua, the police had been monitoring their movements. Shortly after collecting the money, both men were apprehended in Tampines. The arrest of Tan and Chua sent ripples through Singaporean society. Kidnappings were exceedingly rare in the city-state, and the brazenness of the act, especially during a festive period, left many in disbelief. The media extensively covered the case, delving into the backgrounds of the perpetrators and the circumstances that led them to commit such a heinous crime. As the legal proceedings commenced, the public awaited justice. The case served as a stark reminder of the lengths to which individuals might go when driven by desperation. It also underscored the importance of community vigilance and the effectiveness of law enforcement in swiftly resolving such incidents. In the ensuing trial, both Tan and Chua faced charges of kidnapping for ransom, a grave offense under Singaporean law. The court proceedings were closely followed by the public, reflecting the nation's collective concern over the incident. The case not only highlighted the severity of the crime, but also the broader societal issues that can lead individuals down such a perilous path. The swift resolution of the case, from the arrest to the trial, demonstrated the efficiency of Singapore's legal system. It also reinforced the message that such acts of criminality would not be tolerated and would be met with the full force of the law. In the aftermath, discussions emerged about the underlying factors that contribute to such desperate actions. While the crime was inexcusable, It prompted a deeper examination of the societal pressures and financial strains that can drive individuals to commit such offenses. The case of Tan Ping Kun and Chua Ser Lin remains a poignant chapter in Singapore's criminal history, serving as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the nation's commitment to justice and public safety. The courtroom was packed when Tan Ping Kun and Chua Ser Lin stood before the judge. Journalists, members of the public, and legal experts had all gathered, eager to witness the trial of one of Singapore's most shocking kidnapping cases in recent memory. The severity of their crime, abducting a child for ransom, ensured that there would be no leniency in the judicial process. In Singapore, kidnapping for ransom was a capital offense, carrying the death penalty as the maximum sentence. From the outset, the prosecution wasted no time in laying out the cold, calculated manner in which Tan and Chua had carried out their crime. The lead prosecutor detailed how the two men had spent weeks planning the abduction, studying the movements of their target family, and acquiring the tools necessary for the crime. Chua had purchased a mask and gloves to conceal his identity, while Tan had altered the license plates of their vehicle to avoid detection. The prosecution emphasized that this was no impulsive crime, but a premeditated act driven by greed and desperation. The prosecution then played recordings of the ransom calls made to the victim's father, where Chua's voice could be heard issuing threats if the money was not delivered. The courtroom fell silent as the chilling words echoed through the speakers. "Don't try anything stupid. We are watching. If you call the police, you will regret it." The victim's father, a well-respected businessman, took the stand to recount the horrifying hours he spent negotiating with the kidnappers. He described the terror that gripped him as he pleaded for the safe return of his daughter. His voice trembled as he recalled the moment he received confirmation that his little girl had been found, unharmed but deeply shaken. The young victim herself did not testify in court, as child psychologists advised against subjecting her to further trauma. However, statements from her brothers and other witnesses painted a vivid picture of the abduction. The catering assistant who had witnessed the kidnapping described how the masked man had moved swiftly, how the little girl had screamed, and how the entire household had been thrown into chaos in an instant. One of the most damning pieces of evidence presented by the prosecution was the surveillance footage from the ransom drop-off location. The grainy video showed Tan and Chua arriving in their vehicle, Tan stepping out to collect the bag filled with cash, and their hurried escape. Within minutes of collecting the money, undercover officers had begun tailing them, leading to their eventual capture in Tampines. Tan and Chua's defense lawyers attempted to argue that the crime was a result of extreme financial distress. They painted a picture of two men pushed to the brink by mounting debts and the pressure of creditors closing in. Tan's lawyer pleaded for the court to consider his client's mental state at the time, arguing that he had been consumed by desperation and had seen no other way out. Chua's defense was similar, with his lawyer arguing that his client had been influenced by Tan's manipulations and was not the true mastermind of the operation. However, the prosecution swiftly dismantled these claims. Financial hardship, they argued, did not justify the deliberate planning and execution of a serious crime. Many Singaporeans struggled with debt, but few resorted to abducting children for ransom. The prosecution also highlighted Chua's criminal history. Though not extensive, he had prior run-ins with the law, including charges related to fraud. This, they argued, indicated a pattern of behavior in which Chua was willing to break the law for personal gain. The judge listened intently as both sides presented their arguments. Despite the defense's efforts, it was clear that public sympathy was not on the side of the accused. The media had portrayed them as dangerous criminals, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Throughout the trial, Tan appeared emotionless, while Chua looked visibly distressed. He occasionally glanced toward his family members seated in the courtroom, his eyes betraying a mix of shame and fear. He had known the risks of their plan, but now, facing the harsh reality of the consequences, the weight of his actions seemed to be sinking in. As the trial progressed, experts weighed in on the impact of the crime on the victim. Child psychologists testified about the long-term psychological effects of kidnapping, emphasizing that while the girl had been physically unharmed, the trauma she had experienced could take years to heal. She had suffered from nightmares and severe anxiety in the weeks following the incident, refusing to be left alone and constantly seeking reassurance from her parents. Beyond the personal impact on the victim's family, the case also sent shockwaves throughout Singapore. The nation, known for its low crime rates and strict laws, was unaccustomed to high-profile kidnappings. Parents became more vigilant, schools increased security measures, and public discussions about safety measures became more frequent. The police department received both praise and scrutiny. While they had successfully apprehended the criminals and recovered the ransom money, some questioned whether the authorities should have acted more aggressively to prevent the crime in the first place. The government responded by reassuring the public that Singapore remained one of the safest countries in the world. However, officials also acknowledged that complacency could be dangerous. The case highlighted the need for continued vigilance, both from law enforcement and the public, to prevent similar incidents in the future. Meanwhile, in Changi prison, Tan and Chua awaited their sentencing. They knew the gravity of their crime and the likelihood of severe punishment. Singapore had little tolerance for violent crimes, and the law was clear. Kidnapping for ransom was punishable by death. Despite this, there were murmurs that the court might show some leniency. Some legal experts speculated that the fact that the victim had been released unharmed could work in their favor. Additionally, because their plan had been hastily executed and had ultimately failed, some believed the judge might opt for life imprisonment rather than capital punishment. As the trial neared its conclusion, one question loomed over the courtroom. Would Tan and Chua escape the gallows, or would they become a grim example of Singapore's unwavering stance against crime? The final verdict, set to be announced in the coming days, would determine not only their fate, but also send a message to anyone who might dare to commit such a crime in the future. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver his verdict. The case of Tan Ping Kun and Chua Ser Lin had captivated the nation for weeks, with every major news outlet covering the details of the crime, the trial, and the legal arguments presented by both sides. Now, the moment of reckoning had arrived. The judge began by acknowledging the severity of the offense. Kidnapping for ransom was one of the most serious crimes under Singaporean law, punishable by death. The very act of abducting a child, even if no physical harm had come to her, was an offense that instilled fear and disrupted the peace and security of the nation. The crime was not only premeditated, but carried out with clear intent, to extort money from a terrified family under the threat of harm. Tan Ping Kun and Chua Ser Lin stood motionless as the judge continued. He spoke of the trauma inflicted upon the young girl, the fear her family endured, and the reckless disregard the two men had shown for the law. He dismissed the defense's argument that financial distress had driven them to commit the crime, stating that economic hardship did not justify the terror they had inflicted on an innocent child. When the judge finally pronounced the sentence, the courtroom collectively held its breath. Tan and Chua were found guilty of kidnapping for ransom. However, rather than sentencing them to death, the judge opted for life imprisonment with caning, Tan receiving the maximum of 24 strokes, while Chua was sentenced to 20. The decision was a rare one. While Singapore's legal system was known for its harsh stance on serious crimes, there had been instances where judges exercised discretion, particularly when mitigating factors were present. In this case, the fact that the child had been released unharmed, combined with the relatively short duration of the abduction, likely influenced the court's decision. Nonetheless, life imprisonment meant that both men would spend the rest of their days behind bars, a fate that many considered worse than death. As the verdict was read, Chua lowered his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Throughout the trial, he had appeared visibly more remorseful than Tan, occasionally exchanging glances with his family members in the courtroom. Now, he seemed to fully grasp the gravity of his punishment. Tan, on the other hand, remained stoic. He did not react, did not flinch, and did not show any visible emotion. Whether it was resignation, defiance, or simply shock was unclear. Outside the courtroom, the public reaction was swift and divided. Some believed that justice had been served, that life imprisonment was a fitting punishment for the crime. Others argued that the men should have received the death penalty to send a stronger message against such acts in the future. Legal experts debated whether the judge's decision marked a shift in how Singapore handled serious crimes, or if it was simply a unique case with exceptional circumstances. The victim's family, while relieved that the ordeal was over, remained shaken. Although their daughter had been physically unharmed, the psychological scars would take time to heal. In interviews following the trial, the girl's father expressed gratitude to the authorities, but also voiced a hope that no other family would have to endure what they had gone through. Meanwhile, within Singapore's prisons, Tan and Chua adjusted to their new reality. Life imprisonment in Changi prison was harsh. The days were long and monotonous, marked by hard labor and strict discipline. The caning sentence, a brutal punishment that left permanent scars, was carried out shortly after sentencing. Inmates who underwent judicial caning often described it as the most excruciating pain they had ever experienced. The impact of each stroke, delivered with precision by a trained officer, could tear through flesh, leaving deep wounds that took weeks to heal. It was a punishment designed not only to penalize, but to serve as a lifelong reminder of their crimes. For Tan and Chua, prison life offered little solace. There were no luxuries, no comforts, and no hope of early release. In Singapore, life imprisonment meant exactly that, spending the remainder of one's natural life behind bars, unless the president granted clemency, a rare occurrence in such serious cases. Over time, both men faded from public consciousness. The media moved on to other stories, and the kidnapping case that had once dominated headlines became just another chapter in Singapore's criminal history. But within Changi prison, the consequences of their actions remained inescapable. Tan, who had been the primary instigator of the crime, maintained a hardened demeanor in prison. He spoke little and kept to himself, his past life as a gambler and businessman now a distant memory. Chua, however, struggled. Those who encountered him within the prison walls described a man weighed down by regret, who often spoke of the family he had let down and the life he had thrown away. Outside, Singapore remained as vigilant as ever. The case had reinforced the nation's commitment to maintaining law and order. Parents became more protective of their children, schools implemented stricter security measures, and authorities continued to monitor any signs of organized criminal activity. For the victim, time helped heal the wounds, but the memories of that terrifying day would never fully disappear. She grew up knowing that for a brief moment in her childhood, she had been at the center of a national crisis, that her life had been used as a bargaining chip by two desperate men. Though she would move on, attend school, and eventually build a life of her own, the echoes of the past would always remain. The case of Tan Ping Kun and Chua Ser Lin was a stark reminder that crime, no matter how rare in a place like Singapore, could still rear its head. But it also reaffirmed the swift and unyielding nature of justice in the city-state. The two men had gambled with their freedom, and they had lost everything. And as the years passed, their names became little more than a cautionary tale. Two men who had chosen the wrong path and paid the ultimate price. Story 2. In January 2004, Indonesia was rocked by a high-profile criminal case that captured the nation's attention. The incident involved a violent confrontation between two notorious gang leaders, John K. and Basri Sengaji, both of whom were well-known figures in Jakarta's underworld. This clash not only highlighted the brutal realities of gang rivalries, but also underscored the challenges faced by law enforcement in curbing organized crime. John K., born John Refra, hailed from the K Islands in Maluku and had established himself as a formidable force in Jakarta's criminal landscape. He was reputed to be involved in various illicit activities, including debt collection, protection rackets, and alleged connections to several violent incidents. His influence extended deep into the city's underbelly, with a network of loyal associates ready to enforce his will. On the other side was Basri Sengaji, another prominent figure originating from Maluku. Like K, Sengaji had carved out his own territory in Jakarta, engaging in similar criminal enterprises. The two men had a history of animosity, stemming from disputes over control of territories and business interests. Their rivalry was well known among law enforcement and the public, with tensions simmering for years. The feud between K and Sengaji reached its boiling point on January 12, 2004. On that day, the two factions clashed violently in the heart of Jakarta. The confrontation was brutal, involving firearms, machetes, and other weapons. Eyewitnesses reported scenes of chaos, with members from both sides engaging in a bloody battle that left several individuals injured and property damaged. The immediate aftermath of the clash saw a heavy police presence in the area. Law enforcement agencies scrambled to contain the violence and prevent further escalation. Several individuals from both factions were arrested, and a cache of weapons was seized. The authorities faced immense pressure to bring the perpetrators to justice and dismantle the criminal networks responsible for such brazen violence. In the days following the incident, investigations revealed the deep-rooted nature of the rivalry between K and Sengaji. It became evident that the clash was not a spontaneous outburst, but the culmination of years of tension and competition for dominance in Jakarta's underworld. The authorities delved into the backgrounds of both leaders, uncovering a web of criminal activities that spanned years. John K. was arrested and faced charges related to the violent confrontation. The legal proceedings that followed were closely monitored by the media and the public. The case highlighted the challenges faced by Indonesia's legal system in prosecuting organized crime figures. Despite the severity of the charges, the complexities of the case meant that the legal process was protracted, with numerous hearings and appeals. The January 2004 clash between John K. and Basri Sengaji served as a stark reminder of the pervasive influence of organized crime in Indonesia. It underscored the need for comprehensive strategies to combat such networks and highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement in addressing deeply entrenched criminal enterprises. The incident also prompted discussions about the socio-economic factors that contribute to the rise of such figures and the systemic changes needed to prevent similar occurrences in the future. In the years that followed, both John K. and his associates continued to be subjects of law enforcement scrutiny. Their activities and the legal battles they faced remained topics of public interest, reflecting the ongoing struggle between authorities and organized crime in Indonesia. The events of January 2004 remain a significant chapter in this narrative, illustrating the complexities and challenges inherent in addressing organized criminal activity. In the days following the violent confrontation between the rival gangs of John K. and Basri Sengaji, Jakarta was gripped by fear and uncertainty. The brutality of the clash had left deep scars, not only on those directly involved, but also on the city itself. Businesses in the affected areas suffered, as shop owners were hesitant to reopen for fear of retaliation. Families who lived nearby remained indoors, unwilling to risk getting caught in the crossfire of any potential reprisals. Meanwhile, the police, under immense pressure from the public and government officials, intensified their crackdown on the criminal networks that had been flourishing unchecked for years. Authorities wasted no time in rounding up suspected members of both factions. Raids were conducted across Jakarta, targeting known hideouts, warehouses, and properties linked to the gangs. During these operations, law enforcement officers seized an alarming number of illegal firearms, blades, and even documents that hinted at widespread extortion and corruption. The police commissioner, in a tense press conference, vowed to bring those responsible to justice, emphasizing that Jakarta could not afford to be held hostage by criminal organizations. John K. and Basri Sengaji were immediately identified as the primary instigators of the violence, but capturing them proved to be a challenge. Both men had gone into hiding, using their vast network of allies and sympathizers to evade arrest. For weeks, rumors swirled about their whereabouts. Some claimed K had fled to another province, while others speculated that Sengaji had sought refuge in a heavily guarded estate owned by a powerful businessman. Regardless of where they were, one thing was clear: the battle between these two criminal empires was far from over. Investigators began piecing together the events that led to the clash, uncovering a tangled web of betrayals, power struggles, and long-standing vendettas. One of the key factors appeared to be a dispute over lucrative debt-collecting contracts, a business in which both Kei and Sengaji had heavily invested. These contracts, often operating in legal gray areas, involved using intimidation and brute force to recover unpaid debts on behalf of wealthy clients. With millions of rupiah at stake, tensions between the two factions had been simmering for months, each side attempting to assert dominance over the territory. What truly ignited the January 2004 clash, however, was a calculated move by Sengaji's men. According to testimonies from informants and intercepted communications, Sengaji had ordered a direct assault on one of Kei's most trusted enforcers, a brutal attack meant to send a message. The victim, a high-ranking lieutenant within Kei's organization, had been ambushed outside a nightclub, stabbed multiple times, and left to bleed out on the street. Though he survived, the attack was seen as an unforgivable act of provocation, one that demanded an immediate and violent response. John Kei, never one to back down from a challenge, quickly gathered his forces. What followed was a meticulously planned counterattack that culminated in the January 12th confrontation. Unlike previous skirmishes between the two groups, which had been relatively contained, this battle erupted in a densely populated area, making it impossible for authorities to ignore. The fighting was savage, gunfire echoed through the streets, machetes clashed, and bystanders scrambled for cover as chaos unfolded. Several gang members on both sides were gravely injured, and at least one casualty was confirmed within hours. The intensity of the violence forced Jakarta's law enforcement to act swiftly. Special units were deployed, and within hours, they managed to break up the battle and apprehend several individuals from both factions. Yet, despite the numerous arrests, both Kei and Sengaji managed to slip through the cracks, vanishing into the shadows of the city they had long controlled. For weeks, the police pursued every lead in an attempt to track them down. Surveillance teams monitored suspected safe houses, undercover officers infiltrated known criminal circles, and pressure was placed on anyone believed to be aiding the fugitives. The government even hinted at possible military intervention if the situation escalated further, an unprecedented move that underscored the severity of the crisis. Public opinion was sharply divided. While many feared the unchecked power of these gangs, others viewed Kei and Sengaji as necessary figures in the city's underworld, a harsh but unavoidable part of Jakarta's complex socio-economic landscape. Some even admired them, seeing them as modern-day Robin Hood figures who, despite their violent methods, often provided protection and financial support to their communities. This sentiment made it even more difficult for law enforcement to gather solid information, as many witnesses refused to cooperate out of either loyalty or fear of retaliation. Then, in a surprising turn of events, John Kei was finally captured. Acting on an anonymous tip, police raided a secluded villa on the outskirts of Jakarta where Kei had been hiding. The operation was swift but tense. Kei's men put up resistance, engaging in a brief standoff before ultimately being overwhelmed. When officers entered the villa, they found Kei seated calmly in a leather chair, seemingly unfazed by the situation. As he was let out in handcuffs, the media swarmed the scene, capturing every second of his arrest. He offered no resistance, maintaining a confident expression as though he knew that this was just another battle in a war that was far from over. Some speculated that he had allowed himself to be caught, knowing that even behind bars, his influence would remain intact. Basri Sengaji, on the other hand, remained elusive. Despite multiple raids and an intensified manhunt, he seemed to have vanished without a trace. Rumors circulated that he had fled the country, while others suggested that he was still within Indonesia, protected by powerful allies. Law enforcement continued their pursuit, but as weeks turned into months, the trail grew colder, leaving many to wonder if he would ever be found. With John Kei in custody, prosecutors began preparing their case. He was charged with multiple offenses, including inciting violence, illegal possession of weapons, and orchestrating organized crime activities. The trial that followed would become one of the most closely watched legal battles in Indonesian history, drawing intense media coverage and public scrutiny. But even as Kay sat in a prison cell awaiting trial, the underworld he had helped build did not crumble. His men remained loyal, and his influence still lingered in Jakarta's dark corners. Without a decisive blow to dismantle his empire, many feared that it was only a matter of time before the cycle of violence resumed. And as for Basri Sengaji, his absence left an eerie void, one that would either signal his eventual return or the emergence of a new, even more ruthless player in Jakarta's criminal underworld. As John Kay sat in his prison cell awaiting trial, the underworld of Jakarta remained as volatile as ever. His arrest had sent shockwaves through the criminal network, but it had not destroyed it. If anything, his temporary absence created a power vacuum, one that multiple factions, both old and new, were eager to fill. The streets buzzed with speculation. Some believed that Kay's organization would collapse without his direct leadership, while others were certain that his influence was far from over. Those loyal to him continued to operate in the shadows, ensuring that the business of debt collection, extortion, and protection rackets remained uninterrupted. Even behind bars, Kay still had the ability to communicate with his people through a network of trusted intermediaries. Meanwhile, Basri Sengaji remained missing, and his disappearance only added to the uncertainty. For months, police pursued every possible lead, but Sengaji was nowhere to be found. Some believed he had fled to another country under a false identity, aided by his wealthy and well-connected allies. Others whispered that he had been secretly eliminated by his own men, who saw his growing recklessness as a threat to their survival. There were even those who suggested that he was still in Jakarta, lying low and waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Without a clear leader on either side, a quiet but tense standoff settled over the criminal underworld. The chaos of open gang warfare had momentarily subsided, but everyone knew that it was only temporary. In the absence of direct conflict, the struggle for dominance had shifted to the shadows. Silent assassinations, strategic betrayals, and discreet power moves became the new weapons of choice. Law enforcement, sensing an opportunity to finally dismantle these criminal organizations, increased their efforts. More raids were conducted, more arrests were made, and key members of both Kay's and Sengaji's factions were taken into custody. Yet, despite these efforts, the roots of organized crime ran deep. Even those who were arrested often found ways to evade harsh punishment, using money, influence, or sheer intimidation to bend the system in their favor. John Kay's trial became a spectacle unlike any other. The media covered every detail, turning him into an almost mythical figure, either a feared criminal mastermind or a misunderstood anti-hero, depending on which news outlet you followed. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw him as a ruthless enforcer who had ruled Jakarta's underworld with an iron fist, while others believed he was merely a product of a broken system, one in which corruption and violence were the only means of survival. The courtroom was packed each day, with reporters, family members, and curious onlookers all eager to witness the proceedings. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence against Kay, linking him to violent crimes, illegal weapons possession, and orchestrated acts of terror. Witnesses were brought in, some reluctantly, fearing retaliation, but many refused to testify altogether, either out of loyalty or sheer terror. The defense, on the other hand, painted a different picture. They argued that John Kay was being made a scapegoat, a symbol of law enforcement's desperation to appear in control. They questioned the validity of certain testimonies, pointing out inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. They even suggested that the true orchestrators of Jakarta's violence remained at large, protected by powerful figures who had long evaded justice. Despite the intense legal battle, the outcome was inevitable. With overwhelming evidence stacked against him, John Kay was found guilty on multiple charges. The judge handed down a lengthy prison sentence, ensuring that he would remain behind bars for many years to come. But even as the verdict was read, there was no celebration, no sense of finality. Everyone in the courtroom knew that Kay's imprisonment did not mean the end of the war. It simply meant that the battle lines had shifted. In the days following his sentencing, Jakarta's criminal landscape began to evolve once more. New leaders emerged, eager to claim the territories left vulnerable in Kay's absence. Some of his closest allies tried to maintain control, but without his direct command, fractures began to appear. Disputes broke out over territory, alliances shifted, and betrayals became commonplace. Meanwhile, whispers of Basri Sengaji's return began to circulate. Some claimed to have seen him in secluded meetings, while others insisted he was merely a ghost. A cautionary tale for those who sought power without understanding its consequences. His absence, whether real or orchestrated, had created a lingering uncertainty that no one could ignore. For the people of Jakarta, life went on, but an unspoken truth remained. The city had always been ruled by shadows, and no matter how many arrests were made, how many trials were held, or how many figures were locked away, those shadows would never truly disappear. The story of John Kay and Basri Sengaji was not just about two men. It was about the intricate, inescapable dance between power and violence, between law and corruption. It was a story that had played out countless times before, and would continue to do so long after they were gone. And as the years passed, one question remained unanswered. Had the war really ended, or was it merely waiting for its next chapter to begin? Story 3. In January 2004, Indonesia was shaken by a high-profile criminal case that drew significant public attention. The case involved the murder of Bodiharto Sono, the president-director of PT Asaba, a prominent office equipment company. The incident not only highlighted the vulnerabilities of business executives, but also underscored the complexities of criminal investigations in the country. Bodiharto Sono was a well-respected figure in the business community, known for his leadership and contributions to the industry. His untimely death sent shockwaves through corporate circles and raised concerns about the safety of high-profile individuals in Indonesia. The murder occurred under circumstances that were both shocking and mysterious. Initial reports indicated that Sono had been the victim of a targeted attack, leading to widespread speculation about the motives behind the crime. Was it a case of business rivalry, a personal vendetta, or something else entirely? These questions loomed large as the investigation commenced. Law enforcement agencies faced immense pressure to solve the case promptly. The media closely followed every development, and the public demanded justice for the slain executive. Investigators worked tirelessly, sifting through evidence, interviewing potential witnesses, and exploring various leads to piece together the puzzle surrounding Sono's death. As the investigation progressed, several individuals were identified as persons of interest. The authorities scrutinized Sono's professional and personal relationships, looking for any clues that might shed light on the motive and the perpetrator. The complexity of the case required a meticulous approach, as investigators had to navigate through layers of potential suspects and motives. In late January 2004, the case reached a pivotal moment when the primary suspect was brought to trial. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and members of the public, all eager to witness the proceedings. The trial was expected to provide answers to the many questions that had arisen since the murder and to deliver justice for Bodiharto Sono. The prosecution presented a case built on a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and circumstantial evidence. They aimed to establish a clear link between the defendant and the crime, detailing the events leading up to the murder and the alleged motive behind it. The defense, on the other hand, sought to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, challenging the credibility of the evidence and presenting alternative explanations. As the trial unfolded, it became evident that the case was more intricate than initially perceived. New revelations emerged, adding layers of complexity to the narrative. The legal teams engaged in rigorous debates, each striving to sway the jury in their favor. The public followed the trial with keen interest, as it highlighted broader issues related to crime, justice, and security in Indonesia. The trial's outcome was eagerly anticipated, with many hoping it would bring closure to a case that had captivated the nation. Regardless of the verdict, the case of Bodihardo Ingsono's murder in January 2004 remains a significant chapter in Indonesia's legal history, reflecting the challenges and intricacies inherent in the pursuit of justice. The courtroom was silent as the prosecution began laying out the intricate details of the case. The lead prosecutor, a sharp-witted and methodical attorney, wasted no time in presenting the forensic evidence that tied the suspect to the murder of Bodihardo Ingsono. He described how the crime scene was meticulously examined, every piece of evidence scrutinized to establish a clear timeline of events. Blood spatter analysis suggested that the victim had been attacked from behind, possibly by someone he knew. The angle of the wounds indicated a precise and deliberate assault, further supporting the theory that this was a planned murder rather than a random act of violence. One of the key pieces of evidence was the murder weapon, a knife that had been found discarded in a nearby drain. Investigators had matched fingerprints on the handle to the primary suspect, a former employee of PT Asaba who had been dismissed under controversial circumstances. This individual, identified as Andika Pradipta, had worked under Ingsono for nearly a decade before being fired due to allegations of financial misconduct. The prosecution painted a clear picture of revenge, suggesting that Andika had nursed a deep-seated grudge against his former boss and had meticulously plotted his attack. Further supporting the prosecution's case was surveillance footage recovered from a nearby ATM. The grainy video showed a figure matching Andika's build walking toward Ingsono's residence on the night of the murder. Though the suspect's face was partially obscured by a cap, forensic experts had enhanced the footage, identifying key facial features that bore a strong resemblance to Andika. In addition to this, phone records showed that Andika had attempted to contact Ingsono multiple times in the weeks leading up to the murder, raising suspicions that he had been planning a confrontation. The prosecution then introduced witness testimonies to solidify their argument. A security guard stationed near the victim's home recalled seeing a man pacing near the entrance around the estimated time of death. Though he could not provide a clear description, he remembered the figure appearing tense and anxious. Another witness, a neighbor who had been walking her dog that night, testified that she had heard raised voices coming from the direction of Ingsono's house, followed by what sounded like a struggle. Moments later, she claimed to have seen a man fleeing the scene, though she admitted she was unable to identify him in the darkness. Despite the mounting evidence against Andika, the defense was quick to counter, arguing that the prosecution's case was circumstantial at best. The defense attorney, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for dismantling complex cases, pointed out inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. He argued that the forensic evidence, while compelling, did not definitively prove that Andika was the killer. The fingerprints on the murder weapon, he suggested, could have been transferred through secondary contact. Furthermore, he challenged the validity of the surveillance footage, arguing that its low resolution made it impossible to confirm the suspect's identity beyond a reasonable doubt. In an unexpected turn, the defense introduced an alternative theory. They proposed that Ingsono's murder was not an act of personal revenge, but rather a targeted hit orchestrated by unknown parties with a vested interest in silencing him. They cited Ingsono's involvement in multiple high-stakes business deals, some of which had reportedly involved disputes with powerful figures. Could it be possible that Ingsono had been killed not by an angry former employee, but by someone who wanted to eliminate him for financial or political reasons? This revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. The idea that Ingsono's death might be linked to corporate or political intrigue suddenly cast a new shadow over the case. The defense then presented evidence suggesting that in the months leading up to his death, Ingsono had expressed concerns about his safety. Close associates testified that he had confided in them about receiving anonymous threats, though he had never disclosed their source. Adding to the complexity of the case was the fact that certain key documents had reportedly gone missing from Ingsono's office shortly after his death. These documents, according to an insider at PT Asaba, contained sensitive financial information that could have implicated high-profile individuals in corrupt dealings. The defense argued that this suggested a cover-up and that pinning the murder on Andika was a convenient way to divert attention from the real perpetrators. As the trial progressed, the public's perception of the case began to shift. What had initially seemed like an open-and-shut case of workplace revenge was now being viewed through a much more sinister lens. Was Andika truly guilty, or was he merely a scapegoat in a much larger conspiracy? If Engsono had been targeted for reasons beyond personal revenge, who stood to gain the most from his death? The prosecution remained steadfast, insisting that the evidence against Andika was too strong to ignore. They dismissed the conspiracy theory as an elaborate distraction, arguing that no tangible proof linked Engsono's business dealings to his murder. However, as more testimonies were heard, the line between fact and speculation became increasingly blurred. With each passing day, new revelations emerged, making it clear that the case was far more intricate than initially thought. Journalists covering the trial began uncovering additional details, some of which hinted at deeper connections between Engsono's work and influential figures in the business world. Yet, despite the swirling theories and counter-arguments, the central question remained unanswered. Who had truly killed Bodihardo Engsono, and why? As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of the decision fell upon the jury. The evidence presented was compelling on both sides, but it was now up to them to determine whether Andika Pradipta was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If convicted, he faced the possibility of life in prison. But if acquitted, the case would remain an unsolved mystery, leaving many to wonder if justice had truly been served. The tension in the courtroom was nearly unbearable as the trial reached its final days. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of frustration, intrigue, and doubt hanging over the proceedings. Each day, more members of the public gathered outside the courthouse, some convinced of Andika Pradipta's guilt, others believing he was merely a pawn in a much larger, more sinister scheme. Inside, the prosecution and defense prepared for their final arguments, knowing that every word they spoke could be the deciding factor in the jury's verdict. The prosecution stood firm in its stance. Andika had the motive, the opportunity, and the forensic evidence against him. In their closing statement, they reiterated the key points of their case. First, the fingerprints on the murder weapon. Though the defense had attempted to cast doubt on this evidence, the prosecution reminded the jury that Andika's prints were the only ones found, with no indication of secondary transfer. Second, the surveillance footage, which, despite its graininess, showed a man with Andika's exact height, build, and gait walking toward Engsono's residence. Third, the financial records. An investigation had revealed that Andika had been struggling with debt after his dismissal from PT Asaba, further supporting the theory that he held a deep resentment toward his former boss. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was a witness statement from one of Andika's former colleagues. The witness, hesitant and visibly uncomfortable, testified that Andika had confided in him weeks before the murder, expressing his anger toward Engsono, and even making cryptic remarks about settling things once and for all. Though the defense objected, arguing that these statements were vague and open to interpretation, the damage had already been done. The prosecution argued that this, combined with the physical evidence, painted a clear picture of a man who had meticulously planned his revenge. When it was the defense's turn to present their closing argument, they knew they had to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece. They started with the surveillance footage, stating that in a city of millions, there were countless men who could have matched Andika's appearance. They pointed out that no direct footage captured the suspect entering Engsono's home or committing the crime, only that he had been in the general vicinity. They then revisited the missing financial documents from PT Asaba. If Engsono's murder had truly been a crime of passion, why had key company records vanished after his death? Why had Engsono been receiving threats in the months prior? If the prosecution truly believed this was a simple revenge killing, they argued, then they were ignoring the larger, more complex puzzle. The defense took a bold step, suggesting that if the jury had even the slightest doubt about Andika's guilt, they could not convict him. Reasonable doubt, the defense attorney stressed, is the foundation of justice. If there is any possibility that another hand was behind this crime, then you must give this man the benefit of that doubt. After weeks of grueling testimonies, forensic analyses, and passionate arguments, the case was handed over to the jury. The deliberation process was expected to be lengthy, as the weight of the decision was immense. For the first time in weeks, the courtroom sat in silence, waiting for the final outcome. Outside, news reporters debated the case, social media buzzed with theories, and the public remained deeply divided. Some saw Andika as a scorned employee who had lashed out in rage, while others believed he was a convenient scapegoat for a crime that had deeper, more dangerous roots. When the jury finally returned, the entire courtroom fell into hushed anticipation. The judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict. On the charge of murder in the first degree, the foreperson began, their voice steady yet tense. We find the defendant. A long pause followed, the weight of the moment suffocating. Not guilty. Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom, followed by murmurs and whispers. Andika's face remained emotionless for a moment, as if his mind struggled to process what had just happened. Then, as realization dawned, he let out an audible breath, tears forming in his eyes. The defense team patted him on the back in relief, while the prosecution stood frozen, stunned by the unexpected turn of events. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order as some members of the public voiced their outrage while others cheered. Andika was a free man, but the case itself was far from over. The verdict did not mean justice had been served. It only meant that the evidence presented was not strong enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. The media wasted no time dissecting the outcome. Some headlines declared it a failure of the justice system, while others praised the jury for not convicting without absolute proof. But one thing was certain: the murder of Bodhiharto Sono remained an open-ended mystery. If Andika had not committed the crime, then who had? And more importantly, would the real killer ever be found? For Andika, his nightmare was over, at least legally. But as he walked out of the courthouse, a free man for the first time since his arrest, he couldn't shake the feeling that his troubles were far from over. Cameras flashed in his face, reporters shouted questions, but one stood out above all. If you're innocent, Mr. Pradipta, who do you think really killed Bodhiharto Sono? Andika didn't answer. He simply looked ahead, his face unreadable. Perhaps he didn't know the truth. Or perhaps he did, and saying it out loud was far too dangerous. Story 4. In the early months of 2003, the city of Anshan in China's Liaoning province was a bustling industrial hub, known for its steel production and hard-working residents. Life in Anshan followed a predictable rhythm, with factory shifts dictating the daily routines of its inhabitants. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy, a series of sinister events began to unfold, events that would soon cast a shadow over the entire city. Zhou Wen, born in 1965 in Anshan, had recently been released from prison after serving time for an unrelated crime. Upon his release, he sought to reintegrate into society and took up a job as a taxi driver, a profession that offered him the flexibility to navigate the city's streets and interact with a diverse range of passengers. To his neighbors and acquaintances, Zhou appeared to be a man attempting to rebuild his life, a familiar story in a city where many had faced hardships. However, as the summer of 2003 progressed, Anshan was rocked by a series of disturbing incidents. Female passengers began to disappear without a trace, their last known whereabouts often linked to taxi rides they had hailed during late hours. The city's residents grew anxious, and whispers of a predator targeting women spread rapidly. The local authorities, initially treating the disappearances as isolated incidents, soon realized that a pattern was emerging, one that pointed to a serial offender. Zhou had earned a chilling moniker, the Anshan Taxi Devil. His modus operandi was both cunning and ruthless. Under the guise of a friendly taxi driver, he would pick up unsuspecting female passengers during his night shifts. Engaging them in casual conversation to put them at ease, Zhou would drive to secluded areas under the pretense of taking shortcuts or avoiding traffic. Once isolated, He would strangle his victims using a rope he kept concealed within the vehicle. After ensuring their demise, Joe would dispose of the bodies in discreet locations, abandoned lots, deserted roadsides, or disused wells, places where discovery was unlikely. The frequency of these disappearances escalated alarmingly between June and July of 2003. In just a few weeks, 6 women vanished under eerily similar circumstances. The city's atmosphere grew tense, with fear permeating daily life. Women became apprehensive about traveling alone, especially after dusk. The once thriving taxi industry experienced a sharp decline in patronage, as residents opted for alternative modes of transportation or chose to stay indoors after dark. Local law enforcement agencies were under immense pressure to apprehend the perpetrator. The pattern of the crime suggested that the killer had an intimate knowledge of the city's layout and operated with a level of confidence that indicated familiarity with law enforcement procedures. Investigators began to piece together clues, focusing on taxi drivers who had prior criminal records or exhibited suspicious behavior. The challenge was immense, given the vast number of taxis operating in Anshan and the transient nature of the profession. As the investigation intensified, authorities urged the public to remain vigilant. They disseminated safety guidelines, advising women to avoid traveling alone at night and to share ride details with trusted individuals. Taxi companies were instructed to implement stricter vetting processes for their drivers and to install identification displays within vehicles to reassure passengers. Despite these measures, Joe managed to elude capture, his actions becoming increasingly brazen with each passing day. The turning point came in late November 2003. A young woman, who had been wary due to the widespread reports of the taxi devil, noticed inconsistencies in her driver's behavior and the route he was taking. Sensing imminent danger, she discreetly sent her location details to a friend via text message. When she failed to respond to subsequent messages, her friend alerted the authorities. Utilizing the information provided, the police launched a rapid response operation, deploying units to the area. Their timely intervention led to the apprehension of Joe, who was caught in the act of attempting to subdue the passenger. Upon his arrest, Joe exhibited a disturbing calmness. During interrogations, he confessed to the murders, providing detailed accounts of each crime. He revealed the locations where he had disposed of the bodies, leading investigators to the grim discovery of the remains of the 6 missing women. The city of Anshan was left in shock as the gruesome details of Joe's actions came to light. The legal proceedings that followed were swift. Given the gravity of his crimes and the overwhelming evidence against him, Joe was convicted of multiple counts of murder. On January 13, 2004, he was executed, bringing an end to a chapter that had left an indelible mark on the city's collective psyche. The case of Joe serves as a somber reminder of the potential for darkness within individuals and the importance of community vigilance. It also underscores the critical role of law enforcement agencies in swiftly addressing emerging threats to public safety. For the residents of Anshan, the memory of the taxi devil remains a poignant chapter in their history, a testament to the resilience of a community in the face of unforeseen horrors. The arrest of Joe did little to assuage the lingering fear in Anshan. While the immediate threat had been neutralized, the psychological scars left by the killings persisted. For many in the city, the images of the victims, young women, their lives taken too soon, haunted their thoughts. It was as if the streets of Anshan, once bustling with activity, had become a place of quiet dread, a reminder that evil could lurk in the most unexpected places. After Joe's capture, the police worked diligently to retrace his steps, unraveling the twisted nature of his crimes. They meticulously examined his taxi records, cross-referencing the details of his movements with the missing persons reports. It quickly became apparent that Joe had not just been a random opportunist. His methodical nature suggested a calculated approach to his crimes, and it was clear he had been very careful to avoid leaving any trace of evidence. The police also found that Joe had removed the seats of his car, making it easier for him to restrain his victims and dispose of the bodies in a swift and efficient manner. The investigation revealed that Joe had been targeting women who were, in his mind, vulnerable. Those traveling alone late at night, often after having attended late-night work shifts or social gatherings. The isolation and predictability of his victims made it easier for him to carry out his heinous plan. His choice of victims wasn't random either. Joe had carefully studied their routines, and his job as a taxi driver allowed him access to this crucial information. He used the guise of a friendly driver to lull his passengers into a false sense of security, a tactic that had proven effective time and again. The discovery of the bodies marked a somber moment in the investigation. Joe had left his victims in abandoned fields or remote areas, as if trying to erase any trace of his actions. It was only after his confession that the full scale of his depravity became clear. The families of the women were understandably devastated, and the loss of their loved ones cast a long shadow over the city. Grief turned to anger, and residents were eager for justice to be served. The thought that such a predator had been operating right under their noses, his very profession offering him the perfect cover, left many feeling betrayed by their own sense of security. The public response to Zhou's capture and trial was intense. Media outlets from across China descended upon Anshan, eager to report every detail of the case. The trial itself, held in early January 2004, was a spectacle of national interest. There were discussions about how such a man could have slipped through the cracks for so long, and debates on whether the city's infrastructure, from the police force to the taxi industry, had done enough to protect its citizens. The victims' families were in the spotlight as well, and their calls for justice echoed throughout the courtroom. During the trial, Zhou appeared unrepentant. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the pain he had caused, he remained cold and detached. His demeanor was chilling, almost as though he viewed the entire process as an inconvenient formality. His defense attorneys tried to argue that Zhou's actions were the result of a troubled upbringing and psychological issues, but the prosecution quickly dismantled this claim, focusing instead on the brutality and premeditated nature of the murders. The evidence was indisputable. Zhou had planned each abduction with a level of precision that left little room for doubt about his intent. The trial was a culmination of months of investigation and fear, and the final verdict would bring closure to a chapter in Anshan's history that no one would soon forget. As the day of the sentencing approached, anticipation hung heavy in the air. Zhou's fate seemed sealed. His crimes were too severe, his actions too calculated for leniency. In the weeks leading up to his execution, discussions about the death penalty were rampant. For many, it seemed the only fitting punishment for such a heinous act. Zhou's execution, carried out in mid-January 2004, was a grim and final statement from the state that it would not tolerate such barbarity. As he was led to the execution chamber, Zhou showed no emotion. Some in the crowd speculated that he was either too detached to care, or that he had simply come to terms with the inevitability of his fate. Others wondered if, in the final moments of his life, he might have experienced even a fraction of the fear and helplessness that his victims had endured. While the streets of Anshan slowly returned to a semblance of normality, the impact of Zhou Wen's crimes lingered. The city had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth, that a predator had lived among them, hiding in plain sight. In the aftermath, there were calls for greater accountability within the taxi industry, including more stringent checks on drivers and better systems to track their movements. The authorities were also urged to improve their efforts in preventing such crimes, implementing new protocols for investigating missing persons, and ensuring that public safety remained a priority. But for the families of the victims, no amount of reform could bring back their daughters, their sisters, or their friends. Their grief was a constant companion, and the community, though healing, would never be the same. The memory of Zhou Wen and his cold, methodical killings would remain etched in the collective consciousness of Anshan. It would be a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the dangers that lurk in unexpected places. The case of Zhou Wen ultimately became a significant chapter in China's criminal history, not just for the horror of the crimes themselves, but for the way in which it exposed vulnerabilities in the systems meant to protect the public. The tragedy brought communities together in ways they had never imagined, and while justice had been served, it left a deep scar on the city of Anshan that time could not fully erase. In the years following Zhou Wen's execution, the city of Anshan slowly began to recover, though it would never be the same. The echoes of his crimes lingered in the streets, the vacant eyes of his victims forever etched in the minds of the city's residents. The tragedies had left an indelible mark on Anshan's collective psyche, a deep scar that reminded everyone of the darkest capabilities of human nature. Yet, with time, life moved forward. The taxi industry in Anshan was revamped, new regulations were implemented, and safety measures became stricter. Authorities worked harder to build trust in a community that had been shattered by betrayal. But despite these efforts, there was a lingering sense of unease. The knowledge that someone like Zhou Wen had existed among them, hiding in plain sight, had made everyone more cautious, more aware of the risks that might lie behind the familiar. For Zhou Wen's victims' families, healing was a slow and painful process. They found themselves trapped in a cycle of grief and longing, the deep wound of loss never fully closed. They spoke of their daughters with love and sadness, recounting their memories with a mixture of joy and sorrow, forever haunted by the lives that had been cut short. They spoke about their hope that their loved ones would never be forgotten, that their stories would serve as a reminder to the community of the importance of safety, vigilance, and care. While the case was closed in the eyes of the law, for the families, the loss was ongoing, a personal devastation that no verdict could heal. Over the years, Anshan saw changes, though it took time. The once bustling streets now carried an undertone of caution as people thought twice before getting into a taxi, particularly when traveling alone at night. The community, scarred by the events of the summer of 2003, became closer-knit, protective of one another. There was a collective effort to look out for each other, to not allow the darkness to cloud their way of life. It was as though the city had become a little quieter, a little more somber, and in its quietness, there was an almost tangible sense of shared loss. The police force, once under intense scrutiny for its inability to prevent the murders, began to reform. More resources were allocated to criminal investigations, and the public's trust in law enforcement began to recover. There were no more reports of taxi drivers being the perpetrators of heinous acts, and many in the city came to see the reforms as necessary, if painful, steps toward preventing a tragedy like Zhou Wen's from ever happening again. But the scars left by Zhou's actions weren't just on the families of his victims, they were on the very fabric of Anshan itself. For the police officers who had investigated the case, the memories of late nights spent combing through evidence, following every lead, and eventually confronting the horror of Zhou Wen's confession, were not ones that would fade quickly. They too carried the burden of those lost lives, the weight of the city's collective grief resting on their shoulders. In the years following the trial, Zhou Wen's name became a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that could lie beneath a seemingly ordinary exterior. His past, his troubled childhood, and his time spent in prison became topics of discussion among criminologists, psychologists, and the public alike. Many wondered how such a man could turn into a monster, how the good-natured facade of a taxi driver could mask such a horrific reality. His case was used in criminology textbooks as a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding the psychological profiles of criminals and the need for vigilance in every corner of society. Despite his execution, Zhou Wen's legacy was far from over. As Anshan's residents continued to rebuild their lives, his crimes remained a painful chapter in the city's history. For years after the incident, the fear that gripped the city during the summer of 2003 would resurface during times of uncertainty, and whispers of the taxi devil would still make their way through the streets, especially at night. Parents would warn their children to never take a taxi alone, to always stay in groups or take public transport. In a strange and tragic way, Zhou Wen's crimes became a part of the city's collective memory. Anshan would always remember the fear it had endured, the uncertainty, and the immense grief that followed in the wake of his actions. But it also remembered the strength of its community, its resilience in the face of horror, and the determined efforts to rebuild and move forward. While the city had been rocked to its core, it had not broken. It had become a place where people held their loved ones a little closer, where every taxi ride was no longer a simple journey, but a reminder of the importance of vigilance and trust. And so the case of Joe became more than just the story of a killer. It became the story of a community that learned to live with its trauma, to rebuild its sense of security, and to never forget the lives lost in the most brutal of ways. Anshan may have healed, but the memory of the taxi devil and the 6 lives he destroyed would never truly fade. It would remain in the heart of the city, a haunting but necessary reminder that safety is fragile, and that sometimes, even the most ordinary faces can conceal the darkest of hearts. Story 5. In January 2004, a significant legal battle unfolded in the United States that would have lasting consequences for the nation's approach to tribal sovereignty and criminal law. The case of United States versus Lara became a defining moment in the ongoing struggle between federal and tribal jurisdictions. Billy Joe Lara, a member of the Spirit Lake Sioux tribe, found himself at the center of a legal dispute after being charged with assaulting a federal officer on the Spirit Lake Indian Reservation in North Dakota. The reservation, like many others, operates under both tribal and federal legal systems, leading to the complex issues that would soon arise in court. Before the federal charges were brought against him, Lara had already been prosecuted by the tribe for the same incident, pleading guilty to the charges. However, he later contested the federal prosecution, claiming that it violated the double jeopardy clause of the Fifth Amendment, which prohibits an individual from being tried twice for the same offense. Lara's defense argued that because the tribe had already handled the case, the federal government should not have been allowed to prosecute him again for the same crime. The crux of the case was a legal principle known as the dual sovereignty doctrine. This doctrine holds that different sovereigns, such as federal and tribal governments, have the right to prosecute individuals for the same offense without violating the constitutional protection against double jeopardy. The question before the U.S. Supreme Court was whether this doctrine applied in Lara's case, allowing the federal government to pursue its own charges after the tribe had already taken action. In a narrow 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the federal prosecution, determining that it did not violate the double jeopardy clause. Justice Stephen Breyer, writing for the majority, argued that the United States and the Spirit Lake Sioux tribe are distinct sovereign entities. Therefore, the tribe had the authority to prosecute Lara, and the federal government, as another sovereign, was equally entitled to pursue its own case. Breyer emphasized that the tribe's sovereignty, which is recognized by Congress, provided the foundation for its jurisdiction over crimes committed within its territory, even if those crimes could also be prosecuted under federal law. This decision was important because it reinforced the principle of tribal sovereignty and clarified the relationship between federal and tribal legal systems. It established that tribes could prosecute non-member Indians, such as Lara, for crimes occurring within their jurisdictions. The ruling also bolstered the dual sovereignty doctrine, which permits separate prosecutions by different sovereigns for the same act without violating the protection against double jeopardy. While the decision was celebrated by those advocating for stronger tribal governance, it raised significant concerns for others. Critics feared that it could lead to a rise in prosecutions of Native Americans under both tribal and federal laws, potentially resulting in more severe punishments and inconsistent sentencing. There were also worries about the fairness of trials conducted under tribal justice systems, which might differ from the standards applied in federal courts. These concerns sparked debates about the need for reform in the way Native Americans are treated within the legal system, and whether their rights would be adequately protected in this new legal landscape. In the aftermath of United States versus Lara, the case became a touchstone for discussions about the balance of power between federal and tribal authorities. The ruling reinforced the dual sovereignty doctrine, but also highlighted the ongoing complexities and tensions in the relationship between tribal governments and the federal government. It marked a significant moment in the history of Native American law, one that would influence future cases involving the scope of tribal authority and the protections afforded to individuals under the U.S. Constitution. The United States versus Lara case had far-reaching implications, not only for the legal landscape of Native American rights, but also for the broader discussion of how the United States balances the authority of different sovereign entities. While the Supreme Court's decision reinforced the legal notion that tribal governments hold the power to prosecute non-member Indians within their territories, it also opened up a deeper conversation about the practical effects of this jurisdictional reality. For those who supported stronger tribal sovereignty, the ruling was seen as a victory, a sign that the government was moving toward recognizing tribes not just as a vestige of history, but as contemporary, self-governing bodies with legitimate legal authority. The decision confirmed that tribes, in line with the federal government, could independently prosecute crimes without encroaching on each other's jurisdiction, strengthening their role in maintaining law and order within their communities. It bolstered the argument that tribal nations were not subordinate to federal authority, but, in fact, were co-sovereigns with their own distinct legal systems. However, the consequences of this ruling were met with mixed reactions. For many Native Americans, particularly those living on reservations, the case sparked concerns about the erosion of their civil rights under a dual system that might not always operate in their favor. They feared that increased prosecutions from both the tribal and federal levels could lead to unjust sentencing and lack of legal consistency. For example, while tribal courts may have less formalized processes or varying levels of legal expertise compared to federal courts, individuals could find themselves subjected to inconsistent rulings or harsher punishments. This concern was particularly poignant for those who felt that their rights might be more vulnerable under a system that they perceived as operating with an unequal balance of power. The growing skepticism was also linked to the issue of fairness in tribal justice systems. Some viewed tribal courts as lacking the same due process protections and procedural safeguards that were customary in federal courts, such as the right to a jury trial. Additionally, there were fears that tribal governments, which are often smaller and more isolated from the general public, could potentially be subject to political pressures, leading to biased or arbitrary decisions. This raised fundamental questions about the right of Native Americans to receive fair and equal treatment in their legal proceedings, as well as the broader implications for justice when legal systems diverged between different levels of government. One significant outcome of the case was a deeper exploration into the historical and legal status of Native American tribes, especially concerning their treatment by both federal and state governments. The ruling forced many to revisit the origins of tribal sovereignty, rooted in treaties with the United States that guaranteed certain powers, including the right to govern themselves and administer justice. Many Native American leaders argued that the legal interpretation of tribal sovereignty had not kept pace with modern times, often being undermined by the federal government in favor of its own interests. In response to these concerns, some legal scholars and activists called for reforms to ensure that tribal justice systems were on par with federal standards, particularly in the realm of criminal law. The issue was multifaceted, involving not just legal expertise and procedural safeguards, but also the need for sufficient resources to ensure fair trials. The question of whether Native Americans could trust their own tribal systems to provide justice, or whether they were at risk of being unfairly tried and sentenced under a two-tiered system, became a flashpoint for further debate about the rights of indigenous peoples. Meanwhile, the federal government and its agencies had their own set of reactions to the Lara ruling. For the Department of Justice, the decision reaffirmed the federal government's broader ability to assert its authority over crimes that occurred on Indian reservations, even if the tribal government had already taken action. This outcome was important for law enforcement, as it allowed federal prosecutors to pursue cases involving violations of federal law that occurred on tribal land, which could involve everything from violent crime to drug trafficking. The challenge now lay in how to navigate the delicate balance between respecting tribal sovereignty and ensuring that the law was applied fairly across different jurisdictions. The case also highlighted the complexities of prosecuting crimes on reservations, where there are often issues of overlapping legal authorities. Many federal agencies, such as the FBI and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, have jurisdiction in cases involving serious crimes that occur on tribal lands, but they also must cooperate with tribal authorities, who may have their own criminal codes. These overlapping jurisdictions could lead to confusion and a lack of clarity for those involved in the justice process, from law enforcement officers to defendants. In the aftermath of United States versus Lara, tribal nations began to engage more seriously in discussions about how to strengthen their judicial systems to ensure fairness and accountability. This included pushing for reforms in tribal court practices, improving legal training, and increasing access to resources for legal defense. At the same time, there was a renewed push for the federal government to partner with tribes in ways that did not undermine their legal authority, but instead worked to enhance the effectiveness of tribal justice systems. While the case was seen as a legal victory for the federal government in asserting its jurisdictional rights, it also demonstrated the complex relationship between Native American tribes and the broader legal system. The Lara decision reinforced the idea that tribal nations have a significant role to play in their own governance, but it also underscored the ongoing tension between federal and tribal sovereignty that would continue to evolve over time. The decision marked a crucial moment in the history of Native American law, illustrating the intricate legal challenges that continue to shape the relationships between indigenous communities, the federal government, and the U.S. legal system. In the years following the United States versus Lara decision, the legal and social implications continued to unfold across the nation, especially within Native American communities. The ruling, while reinforcing the importance of tribal sovereignty, sparked deeper conversations about the balance between justice, fairness, and the complexities of dual sovereignty. As both federal and tribal governments continued to navigate the overlapping jurisdictions, it became clear that the relationship between these entities would need to be carefully managed, with attention to the rights of individuals caught within the web of multiple legal systems. For many Native Americans, the case was a reminder of the power struggle that has long existed between their communities and the federal government. It highlighted the unique position that tribal nations occupy in the American legal landscape, where they are simultaneously recognized as independent governments with the right to govern their own territories, while also being subjected to the overarching authority of federal law. This dual status left many in a precarious position, as the very sovereignty that allowed them to pursue justice in their own way could be undermined by federal interests that did not always align with the needs of the people they were meant to serve. The case also sparked discussions about the broader implications for Native American communities beyond the confines of legal jurisdiction. Many felt that their rights had been continually overlooked, both by the federal government and by the general public, who often misunderstood or misrepresented the complexities of tribal governance. There were calls for greater recognition of Native American traditions and practices, particularly in the realm of justice, as well as for reforms that would ensure that tribal members were given a fair opportunity to participate in and benefit from the legal system. This included advocating for stronger representation in legal proceedings and access to resources that would allow tribal nations to strengthen their judicial systems and meet the needs of their people. Despite the challenges, there was an undeniable sense of resilience within many tribal communities. For all the obstacles that had been put in place by a system that was historically dismissive of Native American rights, the decision in United States versus Lara was viewed by many as a necessary step toward a more equitable future. It reaffirmed the right of tribes to govern themselves and make decisions about their legal systems, even in the face of federal oversight. It served as a reminder that the fight for Native American rights, though difficult, was far from over. The legal world, too, was forced to confront its role in the treatment of Native American individuals and communities. Lawyers, judges, and lawmakers had to consider how the existing legal frameworks could be reformed to better accommodate the unique legal systems of tribal nations, while still maintaining consistency with federal laws. This led to an increased focus on improving the relationship between federal and tribal entities, with many advocates pushing for greater cooperation and respect for the sovereignty of tribal nations. At the same time, the public conversation around United States versus Lara extended beyond the realm of legal professionals and Native American leaders. It became part of a broader dialogue about the justice system's treatment of indigenous peoples in the United States, sparking interest among academics, social activists, and the general public in issues of racial inequality, the rights of marginalized communities, and the ability of legal systems to adapt to the needs of those it serves. The case raised questions about fairness in the justice system and how the U.S. could better uphold the promises of equality and justice for all, regardless of ethnicity or status. In the years that followed, the legacy of Lara was shaped by both the legal and social responses to the ruling. Tribal nations began to pursue greater reforms within their own judicial systems, pushing for modernized laws and policies that reflected the current needs of their communities. The federal government, in turn, began to take steps to ensure that tribal nations had access to the resources and support needed to implement these changes. The issue of tribal sovereignty was not one that could be solved with a single court decision, but Lara served as a starting point for ongoing conversations about how the United States could better honor the rights of Native American tribes while ensuring that their citizens received the full protections guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. The impact of the case extended beyond legal circles. It contributed to a broader awareness of Native American issues, fostering discussions about history, power, and the rights of indigenous peoples. It also shed light on the often overlooked struggles faced by Native American communities, particularly when it comes to navigating complex legal and political systems that have historically marginalized them. As a result, many Native American leaders began to take an active role in shaping future legal frameworks that would ensure their communities' rights were respected and their voices were heard in the halls of justice. While United States versus Lara did not provide a definitive solution to all of the challenges facing Native American communities, it sparked a necessary dialogue about sovereignty, justice, and fairness. It brought attention to the complexities of the U.S. legal system as it pertains to indigenous peoples, highlighting the need for continued reforms and a more inclusive approach to justice. The case remains a critical turning point in the history of Native American law, a reminder of both the progress that has been made and the work still left to be done in the pursuit of equality, justice, and self-determination for Native American tribes. As the years go by, the legacy of the Lara decision continues to shape how tribal sovereignty is understood and respected, not just by the federal government, but also by tribal nations themselves. The case serves as both a reflection of the struggles that have defined Native American experiences in the United States and a call to action for a future where indigenous rights are no longer an afterthought, but a cornerstone of the nation's legal and social fabric. Story 6. In January 2004, Japan was shaken by a tragic and unsettling case that would leave lasting impacts on its society and legal system. The murder of 21-year-old student Misato Harada in the village of Miho, Tachijai Prefecture, became a widely covered and harrowing case that drew national attention. Misato Harada was a diligent and promising student who disappeared on January 10, 2004. Her family and friends were immediately concerned, as it was completely out of character for her to vanish without any communication. Days passed, and the search for her intensified. Sadly, her lifeless body was discovered in a river near Miho, and the findings were horrifying. The autopsy confirmed that she had been brutally raped and murdered, suffering multiple stab wounds and signs of strangulation. The details of the crime left the local community in shock and disbelief, struggling to understand how such a heinous act could happen in their seemingly peaceful village. Local authorities swiftly launched an intensive investigation, canvassing the area for any potential witnesses and meticulously gathering forensic evidence. Despite their best efforts, however, the case remained unsolved for several years. As time passed, public frustration grew, and the case became a source of anxiety in Tachijai Prefecture. People felt unsettled by the lack of resolution, and the loss of the young life weighed heavily on the community. In 2018, nearly 14 years after Masato's death, a breakthrough finally came. Advances in DNA technology revealed a connection between the crime and a Filipino national named Keith Guinan Ekane. Ekane had been living in Japan at the time of the murder, but had fled the country shortly afterward. Authorities learned that he had likely returned to the Philippines. In response, the Japanese authorities issued an international wanted notice for Ekane's arrest, marking a turning point in the long unsolved case. The arrest was made on January 24, 2019, when Ekane returned to Japan and was detained upon his arrival at Narita International Airport in Tokyo. The news spread quickly, and the media coverage brought renewed attention to the case. Ekane was charged with the rape and murder of Misato Harada, and his trial became a highly publicized event. The country had waited for justice for years, and many were hopeful that this would finally bring some closure. In 2020, after a lengthy trial, the Tachijai District Court found Keith Guinan Ekane guilty of the murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The court emphasized the brutality of the crime and the profound emotional toll it had taken on the victim's family and the community at large. The conviction was widely celebrated, as it marked the resolution of a case that had remained a dark chapter in Japan's legal history for many years. While the trial provided justice for Masato's family, it could not fully erase the pain of the loss. The murder of Misato Harada and the eventual conviction of Ekane underscored several important issues within Japan's criminal justice system. It highlighted the significant challenges law enforcement faces in solving cases that involve foreign nationals, as well as the need for international cooperation in the pursuit of justice. The case also drew attention to the role of forensic evidence in solving cold cases, particularly in an era when technological advancements had made such investigations more precise and reliable. The case had far-reaching effects on the public discourse in Japan, particularly with regard to safety and the criminal justice system. It raised awareness about the complexities of handling cases that span multiple countries and the importance of maintaining strong international networks to track and apprehend suspects. In the aftermath of the conviction, conversations continued about the effectiveness of Japan's criminal justice system and the need for ongoing improvements in investigative techniques. The tragic death of Misato Harada remains a painful memory for her family, friends, and the community of Miho. While the conviction of her murderer provided some closure, it did not erase the loss. The case serves as a sobering reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist in society and the ongoing fight for justice in a world that is often unpredictable and fraught with dangers. As Japan reflects on the lessons learned from this case, there is an ongoing need to address the complexities of criminal justice, particularly when it comes to protecting the rights of victims and ensuring that justice is served, no matter how long it takes. The impact of Misato Harada's murder and the eventual resolution of the case rippled far beyond the legal proceedings. In the years following the tragic event, the case highlighted several key challenges faced by both law enforcement and the public, especially in the realm of jurisdiction and international cooperation. The fact that the suspect had fled the country shortly after committing the crime brought attention to the difficulties faced by law enforcement agencies when dealing with cases that involve foreign nationals, particularly when suspects cross international borders. The delay in bringing the perpetrator to justice also brought to the forefront the question of how effectively Japan's legal and investigative systems could handle cold cases, especially those involving complex elements like the involvement of foreign nationals. The breakthrough in 2018, made possible through advances in DNA testing and forensic science, was a testament to how far investigative methods had come, allowing authorities to revisit old cases with new tools that could provide new insights. This shift in investigative techniques became a focal point for many law enforcement agencies, both in Japan and globally, who began exploring how to apply modern technology to solve crimes that had previously been deemed unsolvable. Despite the progress made in solving the case, the years of uncertainty surrounding the investigation left deep scars on Masato's family and the community at large. The Harada family had lived through years of anguish, hoping against hope that their daughter would return or that the case would be resolved. As the investigation dragged on without any clear answers, their suffering was compounded by the feeling of helplessness that so often accompanies unresolved tragedies. The eventual discovery of the perpetrator, while a relief in some ways, could not erase the profound grief and loss that Masato's parents and siblings had endured. The case also raised important questions about the safety of young people, particularly women in Japan. The brutality of the crime shocked the nation, sparking conversations about the vulnerabilities that exist even in one of the world's safest countries. Many people, particularly women, began to voice their concerns about personal security, questioning whether enough was being done to protect individuals from violence, especially in rural areas where crime rates tend to be lower and communities are often more insular. This feeling of insecurity was compounded by the fact that the suspect had been able to flee the country without detection for years, further intensifying public concerns about the ability of law enforcement to swiftly bring criminals to justice. For the wider public, the case represented a tragic reminder of the gap between the perception of safety in Japan and the reality of crime. While Japan is often lauded for its low crime rates and high levels of safety, the murder of Misato Harada demonstrated that no place is completely immune to violence. The case served as a wake-up call for many, urging citizens to reflect on the ways in which crime, particularly violent crime, could affect anyone, anywhere, and at any time. As the investigation unfolded and details emerged, the public was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that even in a country with stringent laws and a reputation for public safety, tragic events could still occur. The aftermath of the case also led to greater public scrutiny of Japan's criminal justice system, especially in relation to the treatment of foreign nationals. The fugitive status of the suspect highlighted the complex dynamics of extradition laws and the challenges of enforcing justice on an international scale. The Japanese government, in conjunction with international authorities, was forced to address the gaps in cooperation between countries when it came to tracking down suspects and ensuring they faced trial for their crimes. Although Japan had a relatively strong system of legal cooperation with other nations, the case underscored the need for even more robust international collaboration in criminal investigations, particularly when suspects had fled the country. In the years that followed the conviction of Keith Guinan, discussions about the treatment of foreign nationals in Japan's legal system gained momentum. The case became part of the broader conversation about the rights of foreigners living in Japan and the legal protections they were afforded. Human rights organizations and legal experts began advocating for reforms that would ensure fair treatment for all individuals, regardless of nationality, while also preserving the safety and well-being of Japanese citizens. These discussions focused on how Japan could balance the need for security with respect for the rights of those living within its borders. Simultaneously, the case drew attention to the increasing role of technology in solving crimes. The use of DNA evidence and forensic science in the investigation and eventual conviction of Ekane became a point of pride for law enforcement. It served as a reminder of how advances in technology had revolutionized criminal investigations and led to breakthroughs in cases that were once considered cold. DNA profiling, in particular, proved to be an invaluable tool in linking Ekane to the crime scene and ultimately securing his conviction. This technological shift also sparked a broader conversation about how Japan could continue to evolve its forensic capabilities to ensure that future crimes could be solved with the same level of precision and efficiency. As Japan moved forward from the case, it became clear that the lessons learned from Misato Harada's murder would have lasting effects on both law enforcement and society. The case served as a reminder of the need for constant vigilance and the importance of investing in advanced forensic technologies. It also called for greater international cooperation and transparency in the legal system, ensuring that justice could be served regardless of a suspect's nationality or where they chose to flee. For the Harada family, while the conviction of the man responsible for their daughter's death could never fully heal the wounds, it provided a sense of closure and allowed them to begin the long, painful process of healing. The murder of Misato Harada, while tragic, became a catalyst for change, prompting necessary conversations about safety, justice, and the power of technology to shape the future of criminal investigations. It forced Japan to confront its vulnerabilities and reassess how to ensure the protection of its citizens in an increasingly interconnected and complex world. The lessons learned from this case would resonate for years to come, reminding the nation that justice is not always swift, but that with persistence, dedication, and the help of modern technology, even the most difficult cases could eventually be solved. As the case of Misato Harada's murder concluded with the conviction of Keith Guinan Ekane, it was clear that the impact of the crime would linger for years to come, not just in the Harada family but throughout Japan. The murder had shaken the collective consciousness of the country, and the subsequent legal proceedings sparked deep conversations about justice, security, and the nation's evolving relationship with crime. For Misato's family, the trial and conviction marked a bittersweet resolution. While they had waited years for justice, no verdict could undo the loss they had suffered. The pain of losing a daughter, a sister, was not something that could be eased by legal outcomes. The Harada family, however, chose to honor Misato's memory by speaking out about the need for better protection of women and the importance of pursuing justice no matter how long it took. They became advocates for victims' rights, sharing their story to raise awareness about the emotional toll of violent crime and the long-term effects it had on families. In some ways, they found solace in knowing that their efforts had contributed to a greater public understanding of the issue. On a broader scale, the murder and the years-long search for Misato's killer prompted discussions about Japan's justice system and its handling of foreign suspects. The conviction of Ekane raised important questions about the country's laws regarding extradition and international cooperation, especially in cases where the suspect had fled the country. While Japan had strong diplomatic ties with many nations, including the Philippines, it became evident that there was room for improvement in terms of how efficiently international suspects could be tracked and brought back to face justice. Misato's case highlighted the gaps in cross-border cooperation, urging policymakers to revise certain protocols to avoid similar delays in future cases. The case also highlighted the advancements in forensic technology and their significant role in criminal investigations. The breakthrough in 2018, when DNA evidence linked Ekane to the crime, was a testament to the power of modern technology in solving cold cases. In Japan, the case became an example of how far forensic science had come, showing that even long unsolved crimes could be reopened and resolved with the help of cutting-edge techniques. Forensic evidence, particularly DNA profiling, played a pivotal role in securing a conviction that would have been nearly impossible without it. The case drove home the importance of continued investment in forensic technology, encouraging law enforcement agencies to prioritize the development of new tools that could be used to solve future crimes. This newfound focus on technology also led to broader conversations about the modernization of Japan's criminal justice system. Legal professionals and advocates called for reforms that would allow Japan to more effectively deal with complex cases, especially those involving foreign nationals. While Japan's crime rates were historically low compared to other nations, the Harada case revealed that even in a society known for its safety, tragedies could still occur. This prompted calls for better education for law enforcement on handling international cases, as well as increased cooperation with foreign governments to ensure that justice could be achieved in every instance, no matter the perpetrator's background or location. In the aftermath of the trial, there was also a marked shift in public awareness around personal safety. The brutal nature of Misato's murder, along with the fact that the suspect had evaded capture for so long, left many questioning the country's safety infrastructure. While Japan's crime rate had remained relatively low, Incidents like this one reminded people that no society was immune from violence. People, especially women, became more conscious of their surroundings and took extra precautions when traveling alone or in unfamiliar areas. This was especially true in rural areas like Miho, where residents had often felt more secure and less vigilant about potential threats. The case sparked national discussions about how to better protect vulnerable individuals and how to address potential weaknesses in community safety. This led to calls for increased patrols, better surveillance systems, and more community outreach programs aimed at raising awareness about personal security. Some also advocated for more public education on how to respond to dangerous situations, believing that if more people were educated on self-defense and personal safety techniques, it would help reduce the risk of similar crimes. The trial also resonated with individuals and organizations advocating for reform in the criminal justice system. It highlighted the importance of swift justice, transparency, and the need for continuous legal improvements to adapt to the evolving nature of crime. Legal professionals, especially those working with cold cases, began to reevaluate their approach, pushing for more proactive methods to investigate and resolve unsolved cases. The case reinforced the idea that the legal system must be dynamic and capable of evolving with the times to ensure that justice is served. As Japan continued to recover from the emotional and legal aftermath of the case, there was a deeper societal realization of the importance of holding those accountable for their actions, regardless of nationality or circumstances. While Misato Harada's death was a senseless tragedy, it ultimately played a role in pushing the country toward necessary reforms in its justice system and its approach to crime. Her family's advocacy, the media's coverage, and the discussion sparked by her case prompted broader societal changes, from the way law enforcement handled cold cases to how the public viewed personal security. The resolution of Misato Harada's murder may have brought some degree of closure to her family and the community, but the ripple effects of the case would continue to reverberate throughout Japan for years. The country had faced an unsettling reality. Violent crime could strike at any time, even in a society as safe as Japan. The case was a reminder of the vulnerabilities inherent in every community, and it reinforced the need for constant vigilance, cooperation, and reform within the legal and safety frameworks that govern society. While Misato's death was tragic and the long road to justice was painful for her family, the lessons learned from the case, particularly around the need for better international collaboration, technology in criminal investigations, and a re-evaluation of public safety, would help shape a more responsive and proactive approach to crime prevention and justice in Japan for years to come. Story 7. In January 2004, Japan experienced a shocking and tragic crime that would later become one of the country's most infamous cases, both for its brutality and the high-profile legal proceedings that followed. This case involved the murder of a prominent businessman, Yusuke Kuroda, who was found dead under mysterious circumstances on January 18, 2004, in his luxurious home in the Minato district of Tokyo. The case would become notorious not only because of the grisly nature of the crime, but also due to the complex web of deceit, betrayal, and intrigue that surrounded it. Yusuke Kuroda, a successful CEO of a multinational company, was well known in Tokyo's business circles. He had amassed significant wealth and influence over the years, and was admired for his entrepreneurial skills. On the surface, he appeared to live the perfect life, a loving family, a thriving career, and a beautiful home. But beneath this image of success, his life was far more complicated. Friends and colleagues had often noticed subtle tensions between Kuroda and his family, particularly his wife, Haruko, whom he had married 15 years earlier. Rumors had circulated about Kuroda's infidelity, and there were whispers of financial problems within the company that he had been desperately trying to keep under wraps. Despite this, no one expected the shocking events that would unfold in the quiet of that winter night. On the evening of January 18th, Kuroda was found dead by his housekeeper, who had arrived early the next morning to begin her duties. The housekeeper, horrified by what she saw, immediately contacted the police. Kuroda's body was discovered in his study, slumped over his desk with a gunshot wound to the back of his head. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, leading investigators to believe that the murder may have been committed by someone close to the victim, someone who had access to the property. The initial police investigation was extensive. Officers combed through Kuroda's home, looking for any clue that might point to a suspect. It was soon discovered that Kuroda had been a member of an exclusive circle of businessmen, many of whom had been involved in various financial dealings that raised questions. His colleagues in the business world, who had been increasingly worried about his erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to his death, became key witnesses. Kuroda's wife, Haruko, was questioned early in the investigation, but she had a solid alibi. She had been at a social event with friends the night before. Still, her relationship with Kuroda was closely scrutinized. Friends and acquaintances of the couple described the marriage as strained, and there were rumors that Haruko had discovered Kuroda's infidelity just months prior. As the investigation continued, attention turned to Kuroda's business dealings. Detectives found evidence of embezzlement within his company, and it appeared that Kuroda had been skimming off the top for several years. This revelation brought a new layer of complexity to the case. Was the murder a result of personal betrayal, financial troubles, or something more sinister? Was it possible that someone in his business circle, a competitor, or an employee who had been wronged had taken matters into their own hands? The police worked tirelessly to gather more evidence, but the case seemed to be spiraling in too many directions. Then, just when it seemed like the investigation had hit a dead end, a breakthrough came. A security camera in a nearby building had captured footage of a figure leaving Kuroda's residence on the night of the murder. The footage was grainy, but the police were able to identify a vehicle that had been parked outside the house, and a partial license plate number was visible. After cross-referencing the information, they discovered that the car was registered to a man named Daiki Yoshida, a former business partner of Kuroda's who had fallen out with him years earlier. Yoshida, now a disgraced entrepreneur, had a known history of violent outbursts and was rumored to have a grudge against Kuroda for having allegedly stolen a lucrative business idea from him. The discovery of Yoshida's involvement in the case was the turning point the police had been waiting for. They immediately tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. At first, Yoshida denied any involvement in the murder, claiming that he had not been near Kuroda's house that night. However, when confronted with the security footage and evidence linking him to the scene, Yoshida's story began to unravel. After hours of intense interrogation, Yoshida finally confessed to the murder. He explained that he had been enraged by Kuroda's betrayal and had planned the murder meticulously for months. Yoshida admitted that he had been involved in a business venture with Kuroda years before, and after an initial period of success, Kuroda had cut him out of the deal and taken full control. Yoshida had been left with nothing and blamed Kuroda for ruining his life. Over time, his resentment had grown into an obsession. Yoshida had learned about Kuroda's financial troubles and had used this information to his advantage. He had taken advantage of Kuroda's distraction with the company's dwindling profits to quietly plot his revenge. On the night of the murder, Yoshida had entered Kuroda's house through a back door, which he knew would be left unlocked. He had waited for Kuroda to be alone in his study before confronting him. In a fit of rage, Yoshida had shot Kuroda in the back of the head, making sure the murder looked like a robbery gone wrong. Then, after committing the crime, he had carefully staged the scene and left, knowing that the lack of forced entry would point the police towards someone close to the victim. The confession sent shockwaves through the business community. The public was stunned by the details of the murder and the extent of Yoshida's planning. Many questioned how someone could harbor such deep resentment for years, and how easily business partnerships could turn into deadly rivalries. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about the lengths to which individuals would go when driven by jealousy, greed, and pride. Yoshida, who had once been a promising businessman, became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the dark side of human nature. Yoshida's trial began later that year, and the courtroom was filled with reporters and spectators eager to hear the details of the case. Throughout the trial, Yoshida maintained his confession, but he showed little remorse for his actions. He was eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. His conviction was met with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that justice had been served, but sadness at the unnecessary loss of life. The murder of Yusuke Kuroda had a profound impact on Tokyo and on Japan as a whole. It served as a grim reminder of how business rivalries could escalate into violence, and how the pressures of success could push people to make irrational and destructive decisions. The case left a lasting scar on the business community, and the name of Kuroda became synonymous with the dangers of greed and betrayal. As the years passed, the case faded from the public spotlight, but the memories of that cold January night in 2004 remained fresh in the minds of those who had been affected by it. For Yoshida, the once promising businessman, the weight of his actions would haunt him for the rest of his life. And for the family and friends of Yusuke Kuroda, the loss was an indelible wound that time would never fully heal. The tragic events of that night in January 2004 became part of Japan's dark criminal history, a cautionary tale about the cost of betrayal and the consequences of letting hatred fester unchecked. As the investigation unfolded, the police began to dig deeper into the complex relationship between Yusuke Kuroda and Daiki Yoshida. It became clear that their previous business partnership had been far from amicable, and that Yoshida harbored a deep resentment for the way things had ended between them. The two men had initially worked together on a promising venture in the tech industry, pooling their resources and expertise to launch a new company. However, over time, the partnership soured. Kuroda, with his sharp business acumen, had eventually taken full control of the company, leaving Yoshida feeling betrayed and sidelined. Yoshida's feelings of anger were compounded by the fact that Kuroda had secured a much larger share of the profits, while Yoshida's financial situation deteriorated. Though Yoshida had never openly voiced his frustrations, those who knew him described a man who had become increasingly bitter and vengeful over the years. He would often talk about how Kuroda had stolen his ideas and his potential, and how he had been left with nothing. Despite his grievances, Yoshida had always been careful to maintain an outward appearance of professionalism. He continued to operate his own small business, but it was clear that his financial success had never matched Kuroda's. The loss of his business venture weighed heavily on him, and in the months leading up to the murder, his life seemed to spiral downward. Those who were close to Yoshida remarked on his growing paranoia and irritability, but no one ever suspected that his bitterness would eventually boil over into something as violent as murder. At first, the police had little to go on. The lack of physical evidence at the crime scene, and the fact that there had been no signs of forced entry, led them to suspect that the killer might have been someone close to Kuroda. Investigators started by questioning Kuroda's family, friends, and business associates, but nothing about Yoshida's involvement had come to light. Most of Kuroda's colleagues and associates were shocked by the murder, but they struggled to understand why anyone would want to kill him. He was well liked in the business community, and despite his personal flaws, he had never seemed to have any real enemies. The investigators were puzzled. The only clues they had were the security footage showing a figure near the house on the night of the murder, and the faintly visible license plate number from the vehicle parked outside. As the police pursued this lead, they were able to trace the vehicle back to a rental agency, but the registration details were not immediately helpful. It wasn't until they dug deeper into the history of the rental that they stumbled upon a connection to Yoshida. The car had been rented under a false name, but an address and phone number had been linked to Yoshida through several previous transactions at the same agency. The detectives knew they were onto something, but they were cautious about jumping to conclusions. They did not want to accuse someone without solid evidence, but the emerging connection was too strong to ignore. When the police finally confronted Yoshida, they found him living in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Tokyo. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, and he seemed oddly prepared for the questioning. He initially denied having anything to do with the murder, claiming that he had not seen Kuroda in years. But the investigators were relentless, presenting him with the evidence they had gathered, including the security footage and the rental car information. At first, Yoshida stuck to his story, claiming that the car had been rented by someone else, and that he had no idea how it ended up near Kuroda's house. But the police were not convinced, and they pressed him further, showing him the incriminating evidence and asking him to explain his whereabouts on the night of the murder. Under the weight of the evidence, Yoshida's composure began to crack. His body language shifted, and he became defensive, his story growing increasingly erratic. Finally, after hours of questioning, Yoshida admitted that he had been at Kuroda's house that night, though he initially tried to minimize his involvement. He claimed that he had gone to Kuroda's home to confront him about the business deal that had gone wrong years earlier, but he insisted that he had never intended to kill him. According to Yoshida, the confrontation had started out as a heated argument over their past business dealings, with Kuroda accusing him of harboring jealousy and resentment. In his own words, Yoshida said that things got out of hand during the argument. Yoshida confessed to going to Kuroda's study that night, armed with a gun he had obtained from a friend. He claimed that when Kuroda became increasingly hostile and dismissive, he snapped. In a moment of uncontrolled rage, Yoshida pulled the trigger, shooting Kuroda in the back of the head before he could react. Afterward, Yoshida said he had gone to great lengths to cover up the crime, trying to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He took Kuroda's wallet and a few valuable items from the house to stage the scene. But Yoshida had underestimated how thoroughly the police would investigate the murder. His plans to evade capture were foiled by the evidence he left behind. The confession was chilling not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the premeditation involved. Yoshida had carefully planned the murder, waiting for the right moment to confront Kuroda. He had orchestrated every step of the crime, from renting the car to entering the house through a back door, all with the intention of exacting revenge for the wrongs he believed had been done to him. Yoshida had meticulously prepared for the moment when he would finally take matters into his own hands, and the murder was the tragic culmination of years of resentment and bitterness. After Yoshida's arrest, the case became the subject of intense media coverage. The public was fascinated by the details of the crime, and there was widespread shock at the revelation that a former business partner had been responsible for such a brutal act. Many people struggled to comprehend how someone could go to such extreme lengths over a business deal gone sour. The case raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of success and failure in Japan's highly competitive business world, where the pressures to succeed are immense and the consequences of perceived betrayal can be devastating. The media portrayed Yoshida as a man consumed by his own anger and pride, a man who had allowed his personal grudges to destroy his life. The case also prompted discussions about the psychological toll that business rivalries and betrayals could have on individuals. Experts weighed in on the growing prevalence of mental health issues related to stress in the workplace, particularly in high-pressure environments like corporate Japan. Some even suggested that the pressure to conform to societal expectations and to maintain a facade of success could drive some individuals to act out in destructive ways. Despite the shocking nature of the crime, the authorities were able to quickly put together a case against Yoshida, and his trial began later that year. The prosecution argued that Yoshida had planned and executed the murder with clear intent, seeking revenge for the perceived injustice he had suffered at the hands of Kuroda. The defense, however, argued that Yoshida's actions had been the result of a temporary lapse in judgment, driven by years of emotional and financial strain. They suggested that Yoshida's mental state at the time of the murder should be taken into consideration. The trial lasted several months, with witnesses testifying about the nature of the relationship between Yoshida and Kuroda, and the financial and personal pressures that had built up over the years. Ultimately, the court found Yoshida guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The verdict was met with a sense of closure, but the tragedy of Kuroda's death lingered in the minds of those who had followed the case. The murder of Yusuke Kuroda marked a turning point in the way business rivalries and personal disputes were viewed in Japan. It served as a stark reminder of the dangerous consequences that could arise when personal emotions were allowed to dictate one's actions. For Yoshida, the weight of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life, and for the Kuroda family, the loss of a father, husband, and friend was a pain that no legal verdict could ever heal. The case left an indelible mark on Japan's history, a grim testament to the destructive power of anger, betrayal, and revenge. As the years passed, the shock of Yusuke Kuroda's murder continued to reverberate throughout Japan. The case had not only captured the attention of the public, but also prompted widespread discussions about the dark undercurrents of ambition, jealousy, and betrayal in the corporate world. Yoshida's story, once a promising businessman whose life spiraled into violence, became a cautionary tale for others in the high-stakes environment of Japan's cutthroat business culture. For Kuroda's family, the trauma of losing their loved one in such a brutal and senseless way never truly faded. Haruko, Kuroda's wife, struggled with the loss in silence. While she had always known about the tensions in their marriage, nothing could have prepared her for the tragic turn their lives had taken. In the months after the murder, Haruko kept a low profile, declining interviews with the media and retreating from the public eye. She had loved her husband, despite their difficulties, and his violent death left her with a sense of disbelief and profound grief. Although she had felt the strain of his emotional distance, nothing could have prepared her for the revelation of his past business dealings, his extramarital affairs, and the betrayal that had ultimately led to his death. The years that followed were marked by her own quiet reckoning with their shared history, and the realization that she would have to carry the weight of his absence and the dark secrets that had surrounded him. Their children, too, were affected. The murder shattered their perception of the world. As young adults, they had admired their father, believing him to be a figure of success and stability. But the media's portrayal of the circumstances surrounding his death revealed a man who had been mired in personal and professional struggles that his children had never known. The public's attention shifted quickly from the shock of the murder to a relentless pursuit of details about Kuroda's personal life, his business dealings, and his relationships. His children were forced to grapple with a painful duality: the man they had loved and the complicated figure who had been consumed by ambition and pride. The process of healing from such a traumatic loss was slow and complicated, as they had to navigate both the grief of losing a parent and the conflicting emotions that came with the revelations of his troubled past. As for Yoshida, his life after the trial was one of quiet confinement. His once promising career as an entrepreneur had crumbled completely. After being sentenced to life in prison, he was incarcerated in a maximum security facility where he would spend the rest of his days reflecting on the choices that had led him to murder. In prison, Yoshida became a quiet, solitary figure, rarely interacting with others. His mental state, which had deteriorated in the years leading up to the murder, worsened in the isolation of prison life. Although he had expressed regret for his actions during the trial, it became clear over time that his remorse was complex, tinged with the bitterness of lost potential. He often spoke about his feelings of betrayal, but in his conversations with the prison counselors, he also began to acknowledge the destructive nature of his own rage and the weight of his obsession with revenge. Yoshida's trial had been a media spectacle, but the aftermath was less publicized. His life behind bars was one of quiet reflection and, at times, torment. There were reports that Yoshida had tried to engage in various educational and rehabilitative programs, but his efforts were often met with skepticism from both prison officials and fellow inmates. His reputation as the man who killed Kuroda hung over him like a shadow. Yoshida's story remained a tragic reminder of the destructive consequences of unchecked jealousy and ambition. It was said that he occasionally spoke with other prisoners about how he had believed that murder would somehow restore balance to the injustice he had felt in his life. Yet, after years of reflection, he came to understand that he had taken away not only a man's life, but his own future as well. His life, which had once held so much promise, had unraveled in the most dramatic and irreversible way. The case itself continued to resonate in the legal and corporate communities. Kuroda's murder was frequently cited in discussions about corporate rivalry mental health in high-pressure professions, and the lengths to which individuals would go when consumed by personal grievances. The case was used in seminars and workshops designed to address the toxic nature of competitive corporate environments and to promote healthier practices within Japan's business culture. Experts on business ethics and workplace behavior often reference the murder as an extreme example of what could happen when personal and professional conflicts were allowed to escalate unchecked. It became an example of the dark side of ambition, how easily business deals, rivalries, and personal vendettas could blur the lines between professional and criminal conduct. The legal community also paid close attention to the case. Although Yoshida's conviction had been clear-cut, there were ongoing debates about the role of mental health in his actions. Yoshida had been suffering from depression and anxiety in the months leading up to the murder, and some argued that these issues had contributed to his impulsive decision-making. Legal experts debated whether the court should have considered a lesser sentence based on Yoshida's mental state at the time of the murder, though ultimately his actions were deemed to be premeditated. The case sparked further conversations about the importance of mental health support within corporate environments and whether individuals in high-pressure jobs were given adequate resources to cope with their personal and professional struggles. As for the broader public, the murder served as a chilling reminder of how fragile human relationships can be, especially in environments defined by intense competition. It highlighted the potential dangers of harboring grudges and unresolved conflicts, as well as the destructive impact of unchecked emotions. For those who followed the case closely, it was difficult to forget the image of Kuroda's tragic death, which was not only a loss of life, but a loss of the trust and stability that had once been foundational to his family and his career. The crime was a stark reflection of the potential for violence that lay hidden beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary business dealings, revealing how easily success could turn to obsession, and how ambition could manifest in ways that no one could have predicted. Yusuke Kuroda's death, and the events that led up to it, would never be forgotten. The story of his murder would remain a part of Japan's criminal history, a testament to the fragility of human relationships and the devastating consequences of allowing anger, jealousy, and pride to define one's actions. For the Kuroda family, the memories of their loved one would forever be tinged with sorrow, and for Yoshida, the consequences of his actions would follow him to the very end of his life. The case remained a powerful reminder that the boundaries between success and failure, right and wrong, could sometimes be razor thin, and that the impact of our actions, whether motivated by personal loss or professional rivalry, could last far longer than we ever imagined. Story 8. In January 2004, a chilling crime captured the attention of the entire nation of South Korea. It all began on a bitterly cold evening, when a quiet suburb in Seoul was rocked by the discovery of a gruesome murder. The victim was a 47-year-old woman named Eun-ji Park, a well-known and respected schoolteacher who had taught at the same high school for over 2 decades. Eun-ji was a beloved figure in the local community, admired for her dedication to her students and her gentle, compassionate nature. Her murder was completely out of character for the peaceful neighborhood she lived in, and the shock of it sent ripples of fear and confusion throughout the city. The discovery of her body sent the police into a frenzy of investigation. Eun-ji was found lying in her small, sparsely furnished apartment, her body surrounded by signs of a violent struggle. She had been stabbed multiple times, with the fatal blow striking directly to her chest. The apartment showed signs of forced entry, with the front door clearly being broken open. However, there was no evidence of a robbery, as nothing of value appeared to be missing. The police quickly realized that this was not a random act of violence, but a targeted personal crime. At first, the investigators struggled to find any leads. Eun-ji had no known enemies, and her personal life seemed to be just as serene as her public persona. She was unmarried, with no children, and there were no reports of any ongoing conflicts or disputes in her life. The neighborhood where she lived was quiet, and there had been no history of criminal activity in the area. As the investigation continued, the detectives began to dig into Eun-ji's past, searching for any clues that could lead them to a possible suspect. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Eunji had been involved in an online relationship with a man named Sung-ho Kim. Eunji and Sung-ho had met through a popular social media platform that was gaining traction in South Korea at the time. Sung-ho was a 32-year-old software engineer who lived in another part of the city, but the two had bonded over shared interests in literature and philosophy. Their online conversations grew increasingly intimate, with the two of them exchanging personal details and discussing their dreams and aspirations. Eunji had even begun to confide in Sung-ho about her feelings of loneliness, as she had struggled with the idea of growing older without a family of her own. She was a woman who had given her life to teaching, but the isolation of being unmarried had begun to take a toll on her. Sung-ho, on the other hand, was a man who was still trying to find his place in the world. Although he had a stable job, his social life was limited, and he too felt the weight of loneliness. The two of them seemed to offer each other a sense of companionship, even if it was only through their online conversations. However, as their relationship deepened, Sung-ho began to reveal a more obsessive and possessive side of himself. Eunji, who had initially been flattered by his attention, started to feel uncomfortable with his increasing insistence on meeting in person. Sung-ho began pressuring her to make their online relationship a physical one, sending her increasingly desperate messages. Eunji, feeling conflicted, began to distance herself from him. But Sung-ho, unable to accept her rejection, grew increasingly frustrated. In the days leading up to Eunji's murder, the police discovered that Sung-ho had become obsessed with the idea of meeting her face to face. He had become fixated on the belief that their connection was something more than just an online relationship. He had grown increasingly possessive of her, believing that they were meant to be together. The investigators uncovered a series of messages from Sung-ho, in which he expressed his feelings of betrayal and anguish over Eunji's reluctance to meet him. His messages were filled with anger, sadness, and confusion. He even began to accuse her of leading him on and playing with his emotions. On the night of the murder, Sung-ho had finally made up his mind. He arranged to meet Eunji in person, under the pretext of resolving their differences and talking face to face. Eunji, still hesitant but feeling some responsibility for the emotional turmoil she had caused, reluctantly agreed. She invited him to her apartment, hoping to end things amicably and firmly put an end to the unhealthy dynamic that had developed between them. What Eunji had not anticipated, however, was that Sung-ho's obsession had already crossed a dangerous threshold. When he arrived at her apartment, the conversation quickly escalated. What was intended to be a calm discussion about their relationship turned into an explosive confrontation. Sung-ho, unable to control his anger, snapped. In a moment of overwhelming rage, he grabbed a knife from her kitchen and attacked her. The struggle was violent, and Eunji fought desperately to defend herself, but Sung-ho was stronger and more relentless. In the end, he stabbed her repeatedly, leaving her to bleed out in her own home. After the murder, Sung-ho fled the scene, leaving behind the bloody crime scene. He immediately turned off his phone and attempted to disappear, knowing full well that the police would be looking for him. He knew that his obsession with Eunji had led him down a dark path, but he was unable to stop himself from acting on his feelings. In the days following the murder, Sung-ho went into hiding, but his actions did not go unnoticed for long. The police quickly traced his movements and found that he had attempted to withdraw large sums of money from several ATMs in different parts of the city, trying to cover his tracks. Despite his efforts to evade capture, the police managed to locate him through his financial transactions and arrested him within a week of the murder. The arrest of Sung-ho sent shockwaves through the public. The case was widely covered by the media, with many focusing on the dangers of online relationships and the dark side of the internet. The idea that someone could be driven to murder over a relationship that existed solely in the virtual world was both shocking and disturbing. It also brought attention to the dangers of emotional manipulation and the psychological toll that obsession could take on a person's mind. Sung-ho's trial was a lengthy and emotional one. Throughout the proceedings, he expressed deep remorse for what he had done, but his apologies were met with skepticism. The defense argued that Sung-ho's actions were the result of severe emotional distress, exacerbated by his loneliness and inability to cope with rejection. However, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who had crossed a line, unable to accept his rejection, and choosing instead to lash out in violence. The jury deliberated for hours before ultimately finding Sung-ho guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the community, the murder of Eun-ji Park was a devastating reminder of the potential dangers that existed in the digital world. It underscored the need for caution when forming relationships online and the importance of recognizing the warning signs of obsessive behavior. Eun-ji's death, while tragic, also prompted a nationwide conversation about the intersection of technology, human emotion, and violence. Her story, once filled with hope and promise, was now a somber cautionary tale about the potential perils of the internet age. As the trial of Sung-ho Kim proceeded, the complexity of the case became even more evident. The courtroom was filled with a palpable tension, with onlookers and journalists from across South Korea keen to understand the underlying motivations that led to Eun-ji Park's brutal death. Sung-ho, once seen as a quiet and somewhat reserved individual, had become a symbol of the dangers of online relationships gone awry. His actions raised profound questions about the intersection of technology, loneliness, and mental health. During the trial, Sung-ho's defense team struggled to find a way to mitigate his actions. They argued that he had been under extreme emotional distress due to his unrequited love and feelings of abandonment. They painted a picture of a man who had been suffering from deep psychological wounds, exacerbated by his inability to form meaningful connections in the physical world. His growing obsession with Eun-ji was framed as a tragic consequence of isolation, a man who had latched on to the first connection he had felt with someone, only to have it crumble in front of him. Sung-ho's defense attorney described him as a victim of his own mental health struggles, arguing that he had been unable to control his actions due to a deteriorating sense of self-worth. Throughout the trial, Sung-ho remained somber and withdrawn, his face often obscured by the shadows of his own guilt and remorse. He did not attempt to deny the murder, but instead focused on expressing regret for what he had done. His testimony was filled with apologies to Eun-ji's family and statements of disbelief at how he had allowed his feelings to overtake him. The image of a man who had once been gentle and reserved, now standing before the court as the perpetrator of such violence, was difficult for many to reconcile. However, the prosecution took a different approach. They presented a chilling portrait of Sung-ho as a man who had allowed his obsession to fester into something far darker than mere unrequited love. They painted him as someone who had deliberately chosen to disregard Eun-ji's wishes, seeing her rejection not as a natural end to their online connection, but as a personal affront that he could not accept. They emphasized that while his feelings may have been intense, they did not justify the brutal violence that he had unleashed on Eun-ji. The prosecution argued that Sung-ho had been fully aware of what he was doing when he stabbed Eun-ji to death, and that his actions were premeditated. They noted that his attempt to cover up the crime by withdrawing money and going into hiding demonstrated that he understood the severity of his actions. As the trial wore on, it became evident that Sung-ho's sense of entitlement was a significant factor in his violent outburst. He had been unable to accept the reality that Eun-ji did not want a physical relationship with him, and his emotional breakdown over her rejection had been the catalyst for his violent rage. His obsession with her had clouded his judgment, and he believed that he had the right to demand her affection, regardless of her wishes. The prosecution argued that this mindset had pushed him to murder her, showing the dangerous consequences of untreated emotional and psychological issues when they were allowed to spiral out of control. The emotional impact of the trial was felt most acutely by Eun-ji's family. Her parents, who had raised her to be a kind, hard-working woman, were devastated by her untimely and violent death. They had never imagined that their daughter's life would be taken in such a way, and the months leading up to the trial had been a blur of grief and confusion. Eun-ji had always been a quiet, reserved person, but she had a deep sense of care for others, which made the tragedy of her death all the more incomprehensible. Her family had hoped that the trial would provide them with some measure of closure, but the emotional weight of reliving her final moments in the courtroom was unbearable. Eunji's mother, in particular, was torn apart by the loss. She had always been proud of her daughter's career as a teacher and the way she had touched the lives of her students. Eunji's mother had always believed that her daughter would have a long and fulfilling life, perhaps even finding a partner later on, but she never imagined that her daughter's life would be stolen by someone she had only met online. For Eunji's mother, it was impossible to reconcile the image of the loving, caring daughter she had raised with the brutal and violent end she had met at the hands of a man she had never even met in person. The media coverage of the case intensified as more details emerged about the dynamics of Eunji and Sungho's online relationship. As the public became more aware of how the two had met and how Sungho's obsession had evolved, the conversation surrounding online relationships became more urgent. The case highlighted the dangers of internet-based connections and how they could spiral out of control when one party's feelings became unreciprocated. Experts in psychology and online behavior weighed in on the case, warning about the potential hazards of forming emotional attachments with people you have never met face to face, especially when those attachments are not grounded in reality. The case also led to a broader conversation in South Korea about mental health and the importance of addressing emotional issues before they escalated into something more dangerous. Mental health professionals began speaking out about the pressure many people felt to form relationships, both online and offline, and how this pressure could sometimes lead to unhealthy attachments. The case exposed the darker side of human psychology, showing how feelings of loneliness, rejection, and isolation could manifest in dangerous ways when left unchecked. As the trial drew to a close, Sungho's fate was sealed. The jury deliberated for several hours, weighing the emotional testimony and the evidence presented. Ultimately, they returned a verdict of guilty, and Sungho was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Eunji Park. The judge noted that while Sungho's emotional distress was understandable, it did not absolve him of his responsibility for taking another person's life. He was condemned not only for his violent actions, but also for the psychological damage he had inflicted on the victim's family, friends, and community. The sentence was a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked obsession and the importance of mental health awareness in preventing such tragedies. In the years that followed, the Eunji Park case continued to be discussed as a cautionary tale about the perils of online relationships and the devastating effects that isolation, rejection, and obsession could have on individuals who did not seek help for their emotional struggles. Eunji's murder, while tragic, served as a catalyst for change, sparking a wider dialogue on mental health, the internet's impact on human interaction, and the importance of emotional boundaries in relationships. The trial's conclusion, while bringing a sense of legal finality, did little to ease the emotional aftermath for Eunji Park's family and the broader community. Her parents were left with a sense of profound loss that no verdict or sentence could ever fully heal. Their daughter, whose life had been taken so violently, would never walk through their door again, never return to the classroom where she had touched so many lives. The void left by her absence was impossible to fill, and they were forced to navigate a world without the woman who had been a loving daughter, a dedicated teacher, and a cherished friend. Her family struggled with the realization that her tragic end was a result of a relationship they had never even known about, one that had been cultivated online, in the quiet, private corners of the internet. For the community around them, the case served as a stark reminder of how deeply personal and seemingly harmless online interactions could turn into something dark and violent. Many in Eunji's neighborhood had known her as the friendly and approachable teacher who always went the extra mile for her students. Her murder shattered the illusion that the world they lived in was safe from such brutal acts. It was a cruel revelation of how easily a life, once full of promise, could be taken by someone whose very existence had been shrouded in the anonymity that the internet often provides. The conversation about online relationships and their dangers became a regular feature in the media, in the aftermath of the trial. Public awareness campaigns were launched to educate the public, particularly the younger generation, about the potential risks of interacting with strangers online. Experts in the fields of psychology and online behavior became frequent voices in the media, speaking on the importance of understanding the psychological complexities behind such violent outbursts. They spoke about how the internet, while a tool for connection, could also be a breeding ground for unhealthy obsessions, especially when individuals were unable to manage their emotions or navigate rejection in a healthy manner. In the wake of the tragedy, Eunji's former students also had to cope with the sudden and violent loss of their beloved teacher. Many of them struggled to comprehend how someone so kind and supportive could be taken from them in such a brutal manner. Eunji had been an anchor in their lives, someone who had provided not just academic knowledge, but emotional support and guidance. For some of her students, the loss was a jarring reminder of the fragility of life, and many of them sought counseling to help process their grief. The school where Eunji had taught for over 20 years was left grappling with the loss of a beloved teacher and mentor. In the weeks following the murder, a memorial service was held at the school, where her colleagues and students gathered to honor her memory. Despite the ongoing conversations about online safety and emotional health, the broader implications of Eunji's murder were not easily resolved. Many felt that society had become increasingly detached from the realities of human emotion, living in a world where relationships were more often than not mediated by technology. As people spent more time online, they began to lose sight of the importance of face-to-face connections, of seeing the subtle cues in body language, and hearing the tones in a person's voice that could signal emotional distress or disconnection. The rise of social media platforms had facilitated more connections between people, but at the same time, it had created a false sense of intimacy, where individuals could pour their emotions into text without truly understanding the weight of those words on the other side of the screen. In the case of Sung-ho Kim, the tragedy highlighted the dangers of unchecked emotional vulnerability, particularly in a society where mental health issues were often underaddressed. South Korea, like many other countries, had long struggled with the stigma surrounding mental illness. People were often hesitant to seek help, fearing social repercussions or being labeled as weak or unstable. Sung-ho's inability to cope with rejection and his eventual violent outburst were symptoms of a deeper, more pervasive issue: the inability to confront and express one's emotions in a healthy way. His tragic response to his feelings of loneliness and isolation, amplified by his obsessive attachment to Eunji, was an extreme manifestation of what could happen when mental health issues went unchecked. Sung-ho's actions and the events that led to Eunji's murder raised questions about how society could better support individuals who were struggling with emotional difficulties. Could more have been done to prevent the tragedy? Could there have been early interventions that might have helped Sung-ho manage his feelings in a more constructive way? These were the questions that lingered long after the trial was over. Mental health advocacy groups, recognizing the need for change, began pushing for greater awareness and resources for those struggling with emotional isolation, particularly in the digital age. They called for the development of programs that would help individuals better understand the boundaries of healthy relationships, both online and offline, and emphasize the importance of seeking professional help when dealing with intense emotions. For the families of those involved, life continued, but it was forever altered. Eunji's family would never again be the same, just as Sung-ho's family would have to live with the knowledge of what he had done. The relationship that had once been an innocent online connection had ultimately ended in tragedy, leaving behind only questions and regrets. Sung-ho, now a man trapped in the consequences of his own actions, faced a life sentence. Though he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, the damage had been done. The life of Eunji Park, a woman who had given so much of herself to others, had been snuffed out in a single, violent moment. In the years that followed, Eunji's name continued to be remembered in the community. Memorials were held on the anniversary of her death, and her former students often spoke of the lessons she had imparted, not just in academics, but in life. They spoke of her kindness, her empathy, and her passion for teaching, ensuring that her legacy would live on. As for Sung-ho, his story served as a dark warning of the dangers that could arise when love becomes obsession, when emotional pain turns into violence, and when the virtual world creates a false sense of intimacy that can, in the worst cases, lead to destruction. Eunji's murder was a tragedy that would echo through the lives of those who knew her and those who learned of her story, and it would remain a haunting reminder of how the intersection of the internet and human emotions could sometimes lead to unimaginable consequences. The case would not easily be forgotten, and in the years to come, it would continue to shape the conversations surrounding mental health, online relationships, and the need for society to address these issues with greater awareness and compassion. Story 9. In February 2004, Singapore was shaken by a criminal case that highlighted the complexities of human relationships and the tragic consequences that can arise from them. The case involved a 37-year-old man named G. Krishnasamy Naidu and his 39-year-old wife, Chitrabathi D.Onariyanasamy. Their tumultuous relationship culminated in a violent incident that left the nation grappling with issues of domestic violence and the legal system's role in protecting vulnerable individuals. Krishnasamy and Chitrabathi had been married for several years, and their union was marred by frequent disputes and allegations of abuse. Friends and neighbors recounted instances where arguments between the couple escalated to physical confrontations. Despite the turbulent nature of their relationship, they remained together, perhaps due to societal pressures or personal convictions. On April 8, 2004, an incident occurred that would set the stage for the tragic events that followed. Krishnasamy, in a fit of rage, stabbed Chitrabathi twice with a knife. The attack was severe, and Chitrabathi sustained significant injuries. Krishnasamy was subsequently arrested and charged for the assault. However, the legal proceedings allowed for bail, and Krishnasamy was released pending his trial. This decision would later be scrutinized, as it became evident that Chitrabathi's safety was still in jeopardy. Despite the previous assault and the pending charges, Krishnasamy continued to harbor resentment towards his wife. The reasons for his animosity were multifaceted, stemming from personal insecurities, financial disputes, and deep-seated anger issues. Chitrabathi, on the other hand, was described by her colleagues as a diligent worker who tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy despite her personal challenges. On May 17, 2004, a little over a month after the initial stabbing incident, Krishnasamy confronted Chitrabathi at her workplace in Tuas. Armed with a chopper, he attacked her in broad daylight, hacking her multiple times in front of horrified witnesses. The brutality of the assault was such that Chitrabathi succumbed to her injuries shortly after. The public nature of the crime and its sheer savagery sent shockwaves throughout Singapore. Following the murder, Krishnasamy fled the scene but surrendered to the police 9 hours later. He was promptly charged with murder under Section 300 of the Penal Code, which mandates the death penalty for such offenses. The case proceeded to trial, where the prosecution presented evidence of Krishnasamy's premeditation and his history of violence towards his wife. During the trial, witnesses recounted the events leading up to the murder, painting a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and rage. The defense attempted to argue that Krishnasamy was under severe emotional distress and did not have the intention to kill. However, the court found that the evidence pointed to a deliberate and calculated act of violence. Krishnasamy was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. He appealed the conviction, and in a turn of events, the appellate court set aside the murder conviction, finding him guilty of culpable homicide not amounting to murder instead. This lesser charge took into account factors such as diminished responsibility due to his mental state at the time of the crime. Consequently, Krishnasamy was sentenced to life imprisonment. The case of Krishnasamy and Chitrabathi highlighted several critical issues within Singaporean society. It underscored the devastating impact of domestic violence and the challenges faced by victims in seeking protection. The fact that Krishnasamy was out on bail after a violent assault raised questions about the adequacy of legal safeguards for individuals at risk. Moreover, the case prompted discussions about mental health, the nature of culpability, and the complexities involved in adjudicating crimes of passion. In the aftermath, there was a renewed focus on strengthening support systems for victims of domestic abuse. Advocacy groups called for more robust protective measures, including stricter bail conditions for individuals accused of violent offenses and enhanced counseling services for both victims and perpetrators. The legal community also engaged in debates about the balance between punishment and rehabilitation, especially in cases where mental health issues play a significant role. The tragic end of Chhatrapati D.O. Narayanasamy serves as a somber reminder of the perils of unchecked domestic violence and the imperative for society to intervene before conflicts escalate to irreversible outcomes. It also highlights the need for continuous evaluation of the legal frameworks in place to protect vulnerable individuals and ensure that justice serves both as a deterrent and a means of rehabilitation. As the trial of G. Krishnasamy Naidu progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of legal arguments, emotional testimonies, and forensic evidence, all aiming to dissect the tragic events that unfolded on that fateful day in May 2004. The prosecution was determined to establish that Krishnasamy's actions were not spontaneous, but rather premeditated. They painted a chilling picture of a man who, despite being released on bail after a previous violent attack on his wife, had used that time to carefully plan his final, brutal act of vengeance. Witnesses who had been present during the murder took the stand one by one, recounting the horrifying events that had unfolded in front of them. Several of Chhatrapati's co-workers, who had been outside the factory in Tuas during their lunch break, recalled the moment Krishnasamy arrived. He had been waiting nearby, lurking in the shadows, as if biding his time. The moment he saw his wife step outside, he approached with quick, purposeful strides. At first, there was no indication of violence. Some thought he had simply come to confront her. But then, within seconds, everything turned into chaos. One witness, a security guard working at the factory, described in detail how Krishnasamy had reached into a plastic bag and pulled out the chopper. The gleaming blade caught the light just moments before he swung it violently at Chhatrapati. The first strike landed on her shoulder, a deep wound that caused her to stumble backward. She had screamed, a sound so raw and full of terror that it sent chills down the spines of those who heard it. But Krishnasamy did not stop. He struck again and again with terrifying force as people around them began to scatter in panic. Another witness, a factory worker who had been a few feet away, described how he had been frozen in shock, unable to move as he watched the attack unfold. He just kept hitting her, the witness said, his voice trembling as he recounted the events. Even when she was on the ground, he didn't stop. He was like a man possessed. The sheer brutality of the assault had left many of the onlookers unable to react in time. By the time someone gathered the courage to intervene, it was already too late. Chhatrapati lay motionless on the pavement, blood pooling around her, her body marred with deep, fatal wounds. The prosecution emphasized that Krishnasamy's actions showed clear intent to kill. The fact that he had brought the chopper with him, concealed inside a plastic bag, was evidence of premeditation. He had waited for the right moment, ensuring that Chhatrapati had no means of escape. They also argued that his previous attack on her in April, where he had stabbed her twice, was proof that this was not an impulsive crime, but part of a pattern of escalating violence. Forensic experts who examined Chhatrapati's body provided further damning evidence. The wounds were not the result of a momentary lapse in control. They were deep, targeted, and inflicted with precision. Several of the cuts had nearly severed arteries, ensuring that she would not have survived even with immediate medical intervention. One of the fatal blows had nearly decapitated her. This was not a mere act of rage, it was a deliberate execution. However, Krishnasamy's defense team sought to paint a different picture. They argued that he was not in full control of his mental faculties at the time of the murder. His defense lawyer claimed that Krishnasamy had suffered from severe emotional distress, exacerbated by his financial struggles, marital problems, and personal insecurities. They brought in psychological experts who testified that he exhibited signs of deep-seated emotional instability, which could have impaired his ability to think rationally in the heat of the moment. One psychiatrist testified that Krishnasamy had a history of depressive episodes and emotional outbursts, often triggered by his fear of abandonment. When Chitravathy distanced herself from him after the first attack, he spiraled further into irrational thinking, feeling that he had lost complete control over his life. The defense claimed that his actions were not cold-blooded murder, but rather the desperate act of a man who had reached his breaking point. Despite these arguments, the overwhelming evidence pointed to Krishnasamy's intent. The prosecution reminded the court that he had fled the scene after the attack, proving that he understood the gravity of his actions. He had tried to evade capture, only surrendering after nearly 9 hours on the run. They argued that if he had truly been unaware of his actions, he would not have attempted to escape. Chitravathy's family, seated in the courtroom, listened in painful silence as the defense attempted to reduce the severity of his crime. To them, there was no justification for what he had done. Their beloved daughter, sister, and friend had been taken from them in the most brutal way imaginable. They had lost her not just once, but twice. The first time when she was attacked and survived, and the second time when the system failed to protect her. The trial also sparked discussions in Singapore about the adequacy of legal protections for victims of domestic violence. Many questioned why Krishnasamy had been granted bail despite the previous attack on Chitravathy. Could her death have been prevented if he had remained in custody? Should there have been stricter conditions placed on his release? These questions weighed heavily on the minds of many, particularly those who worked in legal and social advocacy. As the trial neared its conclusion, the courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and members of the public who had followed the case closely. The prosecution called for the harshest possible penalty, arguing that Krishnasamy had acted with clear intention and should be held fully accountable. The defense, on the other hand, pleaded for leniency, emphasizing his mental state and arguing that life imprisonment would be a more appropriate punishment. The judge, tasked with delivering justice, listened intently to both sides, knowing that whatever decision was made would carry significant weight. This was not just a case about one man's crime. It was a case that would set a precedent for how domestic violence cases were handled in Singapore. The courtroom fell into an anxious silence as everyone awaited the final verdict. The final day of the trial had arrived, and the atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense. The air felt heavy with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict that would determine the fate of G. Krishnasamy Naidu. Spectators filled the gallery. Some were members of the public following the high-profile case, while others were domestic violence advocates, eager to see if justice would be served for Chitravathy D.Onariyanasamy. Her family sat rigid, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion, their eyes fixed on the judge. The courtroom had seen weeks of evidence, testimonies, and legal arguments. The prosecution had worked tirelessly to prove that Krishnasamy's crime was premeditated, brutal, and deserving of the harshest penalty. They had called witnesses who described in graphic detail the horrific manner in which Chitravathy was attacked, the uncontrollable rage that fueled each strike, and the fear that paralyzed those who had been unable to intervene. Forensic experts had detailed the deep, fatal wounds that left no doubt about the intent behind the attack. Psychological reports, while acknowledging his emotional distress, did not absolve him of responsibility. The evidence against him was overwhelming. On the other hand, the defense had pleaded for leniency. They insisted that Krishnasamy had not been in a rational state of mind, and that his deteriorating emotional condition had driven him to act in an uncontrollable fit of rage. They painted him as a man whose life had spiraled out of control, consumed by jealousy, fear, and despair. While they did not deny that he had killed his wife in a violent manner, they argued that he did not deserve the ultimate punishment. As the judge finally began to read the verdict, the courtroom fell silent. Every breath, every movement was held back in anticipation. The judge spoke carefully, methodically summarizing the key aspects of the case, the sequence of events, the testimonies, and the forensic findings. He acknowledged that Krishnasamy had suffered from emotional distress, but he also emphasized the deliberate nature of his actions, bringing a weapon, waiting for his wife, and launching a vicious attack in front of multiple witnesses demonstrated clear intent. Then, the verdict was delivered. Krishnasamy was found guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to death. A sharp intake of breath was heard across the courtroom. Some gasped, while others sat frozen in silence. Chhatrapathi's family wept quietly, tears not of joy but of relief. The man who had tormented and ultimately killed their beloved daughter, sister, and friend would now face the full force of the law. For them, justice had been served, though it could never undo the pain and loss they had suffered. Krishnasamy showed no immediate reaction. He remained still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Perhaps he had expected this outcome. Perhaps, deep inside, he knew that there was no escaping what he had done. As the guards approached him, ready to escort him back to his cell, he turned his gaze downward. His fate was sealed. The case did not end there. The verdict sparked discussions across Singapore about the legal system's handling of domestic violence cases. Advocates called for stricter laws and better protection for victims. Why had Krishnasamy been released on bail after the first attack? Could Chhatrapathi's death have been prevented if he had been detained? Many believed that the system had failed her, allowing her abuser a second opportunity to take her life. There were calls for the implementation of more rigorous protective measures for victims of domestic abuse, including stronger enforcement of restraining orders, increased surveillance on high-risk offenders, and better access to shelters and legal assistance. Domestic violence organizations used the case as a rallying cry for greater public awareness, urging victims to seek help before their situations escalated to deadly consequences. In the following months, as Krishnasamy awaited his execution, his defense team filed an appeal. They argued that the death sentence was too severe, considering his emotional distress at the time of the crime. The appeal went to Singapore's Court of Appeal, where judges re-examined the case. In a surprising turn, they ruled that while Krishnasamy was guilty of causing his wife's death, his mental state had indeed been significantly impaired. The murder conviction was overturned and reduced to culpable homicide, not amounting to murder. Instead of the death penalty, Krishnasamy was sentenced to life imprisonment. The decision reignited debates in legal and public circles. Some believed the Court of Appeal had been too lenient, given the sheer brutality of the crime. Others saw it as a fair compromise, recognizing both the gravity of his actions and his mental state at the time. Regardless of where public opinion stood, one fact remained unchanged. Chhatrapathi was gone, her life brutally stolen, and no sentence, no punishment, could ever bring her back. As time passed, the case remained a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked domestic violence. It became a case study for legal scholars and social workers alike, a lesson in both the failures and the strengths of the justice system. Chhatrapathi's name lived on in discussions, in courtrooms, and in advocacy efforts, a symbol of the need to protect those trapped in cycles of abuse. For her family, however, no amount of legal discourse could ever fill the void she left behind. They continued to grieve, to remember, to wonder what could have been if only the system had intervened sooner. They carried the weight of her loss, even as life moved forward around them. And in a prison cell, Krishnasamy Naidu sat alone, with nothing left but time to reflect on the irreversible consequences of his actions. Story 10. In February 2004, Singapore was gripped by a criminal case that delved into the complexities of human behavior and the legal interpretations of intent and consent. The case revolved around Mustaza bin Abdul Majid, a 33-year-old man who found himself entangled in legal proceedings following an incident at a local supermarket. This case not only highlighted the nuances of criminal law, but also underscored the importance of understanding the fine line between lawful conduct and criminal activity. The incident in question occurred on the evening of January 27, 2003, at the Prime supermarket located at Block 8, 23 Tampines Street 81. Mustaza entered the supermarket and, after some time, was observed taking a carton of Red Bull energy drink valued at $21.60. He proceeded to leave the premises without making any attempt to pay for the item. The store manager, MDM Neo Lewa, upon noticing this, confronted Mustaza outside the store. An altercation ensued, leading to Mustaza's apprehension and subsequent arrest. Charged under Section 380 of the Penal Code, which pertains to theft in a building used for the custody of property, Mustaza faced the possibility of a 7-year imprisonment term. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Mustaza had taken property from the supermarket without consent and with the intent to permanently deprive the owner of it. They argued that his actions met all the elements of theft as defined under Section 378 of the Penal Code. However, the defense presented a different narrative. They contended that Mustaza had no dishonest intent when he took the carton of Red Bull. According to the defense, Mustaza had a prior arrangement with a supermarket employee who had allegedly given him permission to take items on credit due to his financial difficulties. They argued that this understanding negated any dishonest intention, as Mustaza believed he had the right to take the item and pay for it later. The trial delved deep into the definitions and interpretations of dishonest intention and consent. The defense called upon the supermarket employee, who testified about the alleged arrangement. However, under cross-examination, inconsistencies in the employee's testimony emerged. The prosecution highlighted these discrepancies, questioning the credibility of the witness and the existence of any such agreement. Furthermore, the prosecution presented evidence that Mustaza had a history of similar offenses, suggesting a pattern of behavior. They argued that even if an arrangement existed, it did not extend to taking items without informing the staff on duty, especially when the employee in question was not present at the time of the incident. The act of leaving the premises without notifying anyone, they contended, demonstrated a clear intent to steal. As the trial progressed, it became evident that the case hinged on the interpretation of consent and intent. The defense maintained that a pre-existing agreement provided Mustaza with the belief that he had the right to take the item, thus lacking dishonest intent. The prosecution, on the other hand, argued that any such agreement was informal and did not absolve Mustaza of the responsibility to inform the staff or adhere to standard procedures. In delivering the judgment, the court emphasized the importance of establishing dishonest intent in theft cases. The judge noted that while consent can be a valid defense, it must be explicit and applicable to the specific circumstances. The alleged agreement, even if it existed, did not grant Mustaza unrestricted permission to take items without following proper protocols. The court found that Mustaza's actions demonstrated a disregard for these protocols and concluded that he possessed the requisite dishonest intent at the time of the offense. Consequently, Mustaza was convicted under Section 380 of the Penal Code and sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. The case served as a poignant reminder of the complexities involved in legal interpretations of intent and consent. It underscored the necessity for clear communication and adherence to established procedures, especially in commercial settings. Moreover, it highlighted the judiciary's role in meticulously analyzing the nuances of each case to ensure that justice is served, balancing the letter of the law with the specific circumstances surrounding each incident. As the verdict settled in, discussions about Mustaza's case extended far beyond the courtroom. Legal analysts and members of the public debated whether the punishment was too severe for what some perceived as a minor theft. Others saw the ruling as necessary to uphold Singapore's strict laws on theft and to reinforce the idea that all citizens, regardless of their personal struggles, must adhere to the law without exception. The case became a focal point for discussions on rehabilitation versus deterrence, as well as the fine balance between leniency and justice. Mustaza's background was examined in detail during sentencing. His defense team pleaded for a reduced sentence, citing his financial struggles and personal hardships. According to court records, Mustaza had been unemployed for several months at the time of the incident. He had previously worked as a delivery driver but lost his job due to repeated absences, which his lawyer argued were caused by stress and financial strain. His wife had left him a year prior, taking their only child with her. Struggling to make ends meet, Mostaza had resorted to borrowing money from friends and relatives, but his debts had mounted, leaving him in a desperate situation. A psychologist who evaluated Mostaza before the trial testified that he had been suffering from moderate depression at the time of the offense. The defense argued that his actions were not driven by malice, but by a state of mental and financial distress. They pushed for a lighter sentence, emphasizing that prison would not serve to rehabilitate Mostaza, but would only worsen his situation. Instead, they proposed a probationary sentence with mandatory counseling and job training. However, the prosecution countered with a firm stance. They presented evidence that Mostaza had prior convictions for similar offenses, including a case of shoplifting in 1999 and another theft-related charge in 2001. Though both previous convictions had resulted in fines rather than jail time, the prosecution used them to argue that Mostaza was a repeat offender who had failed to reform. They contended that leniency had already been extended to him in the past, and yet he continued to engage in criminal behavior. If he were given another chance, they argued, what assurance was there that he would not reoffend? The judge deliberated on the sentencing for several days before ultimately deciding on a 3-year imprisonment term. In his ruling, he acknowledged Mostaza's personal difficulties, but emphasized the importance of upholding the law. While the court recognizes the challenges faced by the accused, the law cannot turn a blind eye to repeated offenses, he stated. Shop theft may appear to be a minor crime, but it has a significant impact on businesses and public confidence in the justice system. Given the accused history, deterrence must take precedence. Upon hearing the sentence, Mostaza showed no visible reaction. He remained silent, staring at the floor as the judge concluded his remarks. His defense lawyer later spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, expressing disappointment with the ruling. "We were hoping for a more rehabilitative approach," he said. "My client is not a hardened criminal. He made a mistake, and he needed help, not just punishment." Unfortunately, the court took a different view. As Mostaza was taken into custody, his family was noticeably absent. None of his relatives had attended the hearings, and it was unclear whether he had any support system waiting for him outside of prison. A former colleague, who had shown up on the day of the sentencing, spoke briefly with reporters. "It's sad, really. He wasn't a bad guy. He just got lost along the way," he said. "I don't know if prison will help him or make things worse." Inside Changi prison, Mostaza quickly learned the realities of incarceration. The Singapore prison system was known for its strict discipline, and as a repeat offender, he was closely monitored by prison authorities. His daily routine was rigid: early mornings, strict work assignments, and limited recreational time. Initially, he struggled to adapt. He kept to himself, speaking little and avoiding interactions with other inmates. The weight of his circumstances bore down on him heavily, and for weeks he remained withdrawn. However, as time passed, Mostaza began to engage in rehabilitation programs offered within the prison. He enrolled in vocational training courses, learning basic electrical repair skills. Prison counselors encouraged him to participate in therapy sessions designed to address behavioral issues and decision-making processes. Though he rarely spoke in group sessions, he listened intently, reflecting on his life and the choices that had led him to this point. Meanwhile, outside of prison, Mostaza's case continued to be a topic of discussion among legal professionals and social workers. Some viewed his sentencing as a necessary example of Singapore's zero-tolerance policy on crime. Others questioned whether an alternative approach, such as community service or monitored rehabilitation, would have been more effective in addressing the root causes of his offenses. Social service agencies used the case as a reference point in discussions about poverty and crime. They pointed out that while Singapore had a strong legal system, more efforts were needed to support individuals struggling with financial and emotional hardships before they turned to crime. The case also prompted conversations about the limitations of the justice system in dealing with repeat offenders who were not violent criminals, but still found themselves trapped in cycles of petty crime and incarceration. As Mustaza approached the midpoint of his sentence, he faced an uncertain future. Would he be able to reintegrate into society upon release? Would he find employment, or would his criminal record make it impossible for him to secure stable work? These questions loomed over him as he continued to serve his sentence, each day bringing him closer to the possibility of freedom, yet also to the challenges that awaited him outside the prison walls. As the days inside Changi prison turned into months, Mustaza found himself adapting to the rigid structure of incarceration. Initially resistant, he slowly accepted his circumstances, realizing that bitterness and regret would do little to change his reality. He continued attending rehabilitation programs, though his participation remained passive at best. The prison counselors noted his quiet demeanor, describing him as neither problematic nor particularly engaged. He was simply surviving, counting down the days until his release. But survival was not enough. The real challenge would come once he stepped outside the prison walls. By the time Mustaza reached the final months of his sentence, prison authorities encouraged him to participate in the Yellow Ribbon Project, a government-led initiative designed to help former offenders reintegrate into society. The program aimed to give second chances, offering vocational training and employment opportunities to ex-offenders. Mustaza was skeptical. His past experience had taught him that once society labeled a person as a criminal, the stigma rarely faded. Would this program truly help, or was it just another false hope? Despite his doubts, he applied for a pre-release job placement program. To his surprise, he was accepted into a basic warehouse training course, which guaranteed a job interview upon release. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel something close to hope. He wasn't sure if things would work out, but at least he had a plan, something he had lacked before. While Mustaza prepared for life outside, his case continued to be discussed within legal and social work circles. Some viewed his sentence as a necessary deterrent, an example of Singapore's firm stance against theft, regardless of personal circumstances. Others questioned whether his imprisonment had done anything to truly rehabilitate him. Should he have been placed in a program that focused more on counseling and financial aid rather than incarceration? Would he have been less likely to reoffend if he had received structured support before his arrest rather than after? The debate highlighted a broader issue: how the legal system should balance punishment with rehabilitation, especially for repeat but non-violent offenders. The day of his release finally arrived. On a humid morning in February 2007, Mustaza stepped outside Changi Prison's main gate with nothing but a plastic bag containing his belongings. He took a deep breath, inhaling the freedom he had longed for. But freedom, he quickly realized, felt heavier than he had expected. The outside world had moved on without him. He had no home to return to, no family waiting. He had spent 3 years locked away, and now he had to figure out how to start again. The first few weeks outside were difficult. Despite completing his warehouse training course, he struggled to secure a stable job. His criminal record followed him like a shadow. Potential employers were hesitant, often rejecting his application without explanation. Some were polite, while others were blunt. Once a thief, always a thief. The job interview promised through the Yellow Ribbon Project fell through when the company decided to go with another candidate. He had expected it, yet it still stung. With no steady income, Mustaza found himself relying on temporary labor jobs, cleaning shifts, construction work, anything that paid daily wages. It was exhausting and unstable, but he reminded himself that at least he was staying out of trouble. He refused to give up, though temptation lurked in the background. There were moments when he considered returning to old habits, justifying it as a necessity. No one was willing to help him, so why should he keep struggling? But each time, he forced himself to remember the years he had spent behind bars. He had survived prison once. He did not want to go back. During this period, Mustaza reconnected with a former prison counselor who had taken an interest in his case. She introduced him to a small non-profit organization that helped ex-offenders rebuild their lives. Through the organization, he found a mentor, a man who had served time for drug offenses but had since turned his life around. Their conversations were simple but meaningful. For the first time, Mustaza felt understood. He wasn't alone in this struggle. With the nonprofit's help, he managed to secure a stable job at a logistics company willing to hire ex-convicts. The pay was modest, but it was enough to rent a small room in a shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it was his, a space that belonged to him, a sign that he was moving forward. Months turned into years. The memories of prison, though still present, no longer defined him. He kept to himself, avoiding unnecessary trouble. He worked hard, saved what little he could, and tried to focus on the future. There were no grand transformations, no dramatic redemption arcs, just slow, steady progress. He was not looking for anyone's forgiveness, nor was he seeking approval. He simply wanted to live. Yet, the scars of his past never fully faded. Society did not forget easily, and some doors remained permanently closed. But he learned to navigate around them, to find his own way. He was not the same man who had walked into Prime Supermarket all those years ago. He had lost much, but he had also gained something invaluable, a chance, however fragile, to rebuild. One evening, as he walked home from work, he passed by a supermarket similar to the one where his story had begun. He hesitated for a moment, staring through the glass doors at the brightly lit aisles. He thought about that night in 2003, about the carton of Red Bull, about the choices that had led him down such a long and painful path. Then he exhaled, adjusted his bag on his shoulder, and kept walking. He did not look back.